Welcome to the Deep Sleep Science Channel. Tonight, we're spending time with a creature that has been watching you quietly, intelligently, and with a very good memory for longer than you might realize. We're talking about crows. Before you drift off, here are a few things worth knowing. Crows remember individual human faces for up to 17 years. They leave gifts, coins, buttons, pieces of jewelry at the doors of people who are kind to them. A crow named Betty once picked up a straight piece of wire and bent it into a hook to retrieve food from a tube. Nobody showed her how. She just figured it out. Crows hold what look like funerals for their dead. They slide down snowy rooftops for fun. They use traffic lights to crack open nuts safely. And their brains, relative to body size, are nearly as large as ours, built from completely different architecture, arriving at remarkably similar results. Tonight, there are 300 facts waiting for you, covering everything from crow anatomy and family life to mythology, tool use, and the deep questions their intelligence forces science to ask about the nature of chaos, mind itself. So get comfortable. Let your breathing slow. Let the day fall away. The crows are already roosting in the dark trees tonight, and we are just beginning. There is a genus of birds so widespread, so deeply intelligent, and so intertwined with human civilization that scientists are still working to fully understand them. That genus is called Corvus, a Latin word meaning raven, and it contains at least 42 recognized living species of crows found on nearly every continent on Earth. Beyond the living birds, researchers have formally described at least 14 extinct species from fossil records, painting a picture of a group that has been thriving and diversifying for millions upon millions of years. When you look at a crow perched on a fence post or walking boldly across a parking lot, you're looking at the living representative of one of the most successful and ancient bird lineages the world has ever produced. The American crow, known scientifically as Corvus brachyrhynchos, is a bird of impressive physical presence when you take the time to look closely. From the tip of its beak to the end of its tail, it measures between 40 and 53 centimeters, roughly the length of a standard school ruler, or a little longer. What's particularly interesting is that the tail alone makes up about 40% of that total length, which gives the bird a long, elegant silhouette in flight. This isn't just aesthetics. The tail plays an important role in aerial maneuvering, helping the crow steer and brake with precision as it moves through trees, over buildings, or across open fields. American crows weigh between 316 and 620 grams, which puts them in roughly the same weight class as a large apple or a small bag of flour. Males tend to run slightly larger than females, but the size difference is subtle enough that telling the sexes apart by sight alone is nearly impossible in the field. This near-identical appearance between males and females is called sexual monomorphism, and it means that researchers who need to determine a crow's sex typically have to rely on behavioral cues, genetic called testing, or close observation during the breeding season when differences in behavior become more apparent. Stretch a crow's wings out fully and you'd be looking at a span between 85 and 100 centimeters, nearly a full meter from wingtip to wingtip. Those wings are broad and rounded, shaped in a way that's built more for sustained flapping than for efficient gliding. In flight, the wingtip feathers spread outward and slightly apart, almost like splayed fingers, a configuration that helps the bird generate lift and maintain control at a range of speeds. This wing shape suits the crow's lifestyle perfectly, a bird that spends much of its time moving between foraging sites, chasing rivals, and navigating complex environments full of trees, buildings, and other obstacles. Crow feathers are not simply black, though they certainly appear that way at a casual glance. They contain melanin, the same dark pigment responsible for dark coloring in human hair and skin. But the melanin in crow feathers does something extra. It creates what's called structural iridescence. This means that the microscopic physical architecture of the feathers interacts with light in a way that scatters certain wavelengths more than others, causing the plumage to shimmer with shifting hues of violet, blue, and green when the light hits at the right angle. On a bright, clear day, a crow in full adult plumage can look almost jewel-like, a dramatic contrast to their reputation as simply black birds. The melanin in crow feathers does more than produce color. It actually strengthens the feather itself at a molecular level, making crow feathers measurably harder, more resistant to abrasion, and better protected against the damaging effects of ultraviolet radiation than lighter-colored feathers in other bird species. This is a real survival advantage. Feathers are the crow's primary insulation, waterproofing, and flight mechanism all at once. So having feathers that resist wear means the crow can maintain peak flight performance for tamen, longer between molts. In some environments where birds spend a lot of time moving through rough vegetation, this physical durability could make a meaningful difference in how well an individual crow survives. Crows molt, replacing their feathers once a year, in a complete annual molt that begins after the breeding season winds down. During this period, old feathers are shed and new ones grow in their place. Because the old feathers have spent months being worn down by sun, wind, rain, and physical contact, they can appear distinctly brownish or scaly compared to the crisp, glossy new feathers coming in. If you've ever seen a crow that looked a bit ragged or patchy, it was almost certainly in the middle of this molt process. It's a completely normal and healthy part of the crow's annual cycle, not a sign of illness or poor condition. Baby crows arrive in the world looking nothing like their sleek, glossy parents. Newly hatched crows are covered in sparse, grayish down feathers rather than the rich black plumage adults display. Their eyes at hatching are a soft blue-gray rather than the deep, dark eyes of adults. Even the inside of their mouths, visible when they gape for food, is a vivid pink, a color that serves as a visual signal to parents and helpers, making it easy to see exactly where to deposit a meal in low-light conditions. Over the weeks following hatching, all of these features gradually shift. The down is replaced by juvenile feathers, the eyes darken, and the mouth lining transitions from pink to black as the bird matures. The bill of an American crow is one of its most important tools, and it varies more than you might expect across the species range. Across the population, bills measure between 3 and 5 centimeters in length, a meaningful range with birds in the far western portions of North America tending to have smaller bills than those in the east. This kind of geographic variation in bill size, called clinell variation, reflects the fact that different populations have adapted over many generations to slightly different food sources and foraging conditions. A crow's bill is its primary instrument for probing soil, breaking open seeds, tearing apart food, and manipulating objects, so even small differences in its shape and size can have real ecological consequences. From their legs and feet to their bills and even their eyes, American crows are uniformly dark, making them one of the very few bird species in the world with no contrasting patches, stripes, or spots of lighter color dull anywhere on their bodies. This all-black coloration is striking enough that many cultures have found it significant, associating crows with night, mystery, and the boundary between worlds. From a purely biological perspective, this uniform dark pigmentation driven by dense melanin deposition throughout the body is unusual among birds, most of which display at least some degree of color, contrast, or pattern. The part of the crow's leg called the tarsus, roughly equivalent to the lower leg in a human, measures between 5.5 and 6.5 centimeters. This gives the crow a notably upright, almost stately posture when standing on the ground, an appearance that contributes to the impression many observers have of crows as alert and purposeful rather than skittish or hurried. The long legs also allow effective walking and running on the ground. Crows are comfortable foragers on flat surfaces, where they probe, flip, and dig through leaf litter and soil with their bills while moving in a steady, unhurried camper, hop or walk. Watching a crow in flight reveals something interesting about how it moves through the air compared to its larger relative, the raven. American crows are characterized by a steady, direct flapping style, powerful, continuous wing beats that carry them efficiently from one place to another. Unlike ravens, which are famous for soaring on thermals and updrafts for long periods, crows rarely glide for more than a few seconds before resuming their wing beats. This constant flapping takes more energy than soaring, but it also gives the crow greater control and maneuverability in the complex, often cluttered environments. Tree canopies, urban spaces, agricultural fields where they spend most of their time. The average American crow living in the wild can be expected to survive for 7 to 8 years, a respectable lifespan for a bird of their size, though considerably shorter than what the same individual might achieve under several. Ideal conditions. Some crows have pushed well past this average. Individuals surviving 14 years in the wild have been documented, and captive crows, freed from the risks of predation, disease, and harsh weather, have been par, documented living past 30 years. These long-lived captive individuals give researchers a window into what crow cognition and behavior look like in very old birds. And the answer, it turns out, is that crows remain sharp, curious, and socially engaged for most of their lives. Among the remarkable outliers in crow longevity records is a single wild crow reported to have lived 29 years, a genuinely extraordinary lifespan for any wild passerine bird. Researchers who study crow populations using individually marked birds have used survival analysis, essentially statistical modeling of how quickly marked individuals disappear from populations, over time to estimate that under the right conditions, some crows could theoretically live 17 to 21 years. These estimates suggest that what limits crow lifespan in the wild is not biological aging so much as the accumulated risks of surviving in a world with predators, harsh winters, disease, and human-related hazards. Within established crow populations, adult breeders who have secured territories and partners are remarkably stable from year to year. Their annual survival rate, the probability of surviving from one year to the next, sits at approximately 93%, meaning fewer than 1 in 10 established breeders dies in any given year. Younger birds serving as helpers at other birds' nests fare somewhat worse, surviving at roughly 75% per year. This difference likely reflects both the additional risks helpers take on. They're often the ones most exposed while defending the nest, and the fact that helpers haven't yet had the years of experience that older breeders bring to avoiding danger. For young crows, the first year of life is by far the most dangerous. Studies of banded birds have found that approximately half of all young crows banded in the nest are alive and accounted for by the following breeding season. Some of those missing birds have simply moved beyond the study area and are technically still alive, but many have genuinely died to predators, starvation, disease, or accidents. This pattern, where juvenile mortality is dramatically higher than adult mortality, is common in long-lived, slower-producing animals and represents a biological reality that shapes how crows and crow family groups invest in raising and protecting young. American crows are not particularly fast flyers by bird standards, but they're steady and efficient. Under normal conditions, they cruise at speeds between 32 and 40 kilometers per hour, roughly comparable to a person cycling at a moderate pace. Of course, speed varies depending on whether the crow is traveling between roost and foraging area, chasing a rival, or riding a strong tailwind. What crows lack in top-end speed, they more than compensate for. In navigation and endurance, they can cover impressive distances each day in the course of their normal activities, traveling many miles between roost sites and foraging areas. Crows are classified as passerine birds, a grouping that scientists also call songbirds, or more technically, oscines. This places crows in the same enormous order as sparrows, warblers, finches, and thrushes, birds that most people would never intuitively group with crows. The songbird designation refers specifically to a particular anatomical arrangement of the vocal apparatus, not to the pleasantness of the sounds produced. Crows absolutely qualify as songbirds by this technical definition, even though their signature call sounds nothing like the melodious whistles most people associate with the word. It's a reminder that biological classification is based on evolutionary history and anatomy, not on what sounds pleasant to human ears. When researchers count the neurons in a crow's brain, they arrive at a number around 1.5 billion, a figure comparable to what you'd find in some species of monkeys. What makes this especially interesting is that crow neurons are more densely packed than neurons in the brains of comparably sized mammals. Because the neurons are closer together, the connections between them are shorter, and signals can travel between regions of the brain more quickly and efficiently. This architectural difference, smaller, more tightly packed neurons, appears to be an adaptation in birds that reduces brain weight while maintaining or enhancing processing power, a critical advantage for any flying power animal. The brain-to-body mass ratio of crows sits remarkably close to that of humans, meaning that relative to their body size, crows are carrying around about as much brain tissue as we are. Their brains feature a large region called the pallium, a layered structure that covers the upper surface of the brain and is responsible for much of the higher cognitive processing that crow researchers have documented. The pallium is anatomically quite different from the mammalian neocortex, but it performs many of the same functions, integrating sensory information, supporting working memory, enabling planning, and allowing flexible behavior in response to novel situations. It's a different road to the same destination. In crows, conscious thought, the kind of deliberate, reflective processing that allows an animal to weigh options and choose a course of action, appears to take place in the pallium rather than the neocortex, which crows simply don't have. This was a significant discovery for neuroscience, because for a long time, the neocortex was assumed to be the essential biological substrate for advanced cognition, the structure you needed in order to think in complex ways. The crow demonstrates that this assumption was too narrow. Intelligence, it turns out, is not tied to a specific anatomical structure. It's tied to the functional organization of neural circuits, and those circuits can be built in more than one way. In 2020, a study published in a leading scientific journal demonstrated for the first time that carrion crows, the European relatives of American crows, have subjective sensory consciousness. This means they don't just process sensory information mechanically, like a camera recording an image, but actually experience their perceptions they are aware of seeing, hearing, feeling. This level of inner experience had previously been assumed to be a primate-specific capacity, something tied to the mammalian brain's particular complexity. The crow data challenged that assumption directly, suggesting that the architecture needed to support conscious awareness is broader and more ancient than scientists had recognized. To study what's actually happening in a crow's brain, researchers have used positron emission tomography, PET, scanning a technique that reveals which brain regions are consuming energy and therefore actively working at any given moment. When crows were shown images made to solve problems or confronted with challenging situations during PET scans, the resulting images showed that their higher cognitive brain regions lit up consistently the same regions associated with planning, deliberation, and flexible reasoning. This wasn't just the basic sensory processing that any animal engages in. It was evidence of active, effortful thought. The last common ancestor of birds and mammals lived approximately 320 million years ago, deep in geological time, before dinosaurs dominated the Earth, before flowering plants existed, before the continents had separated into their current positions. Since that divergence, the lineages leading to modern crows and modern humans have been evolving completely independently. The fact that both ended up with sophisticated problem-solving abilities, complex social lives, and rich communication systems, despite hundreds of millions of years of independent evolution, raises a profound question. Is intelligence something that arises almost inevitably when evolution has enough time and selection pressure to work with? Or did crows and primates inherit some ancient cognitive potential from a common ancestor? Crow reasoning ability has been measured against human developmental benchmarks using a clever experimental paradigm inspired by 1A. Of Aesop's ancient fables, the story of a thirsty crow that drops stones into a pitcher to raise the water level and reach the water. When scientists presented real crows with this exact challenge, a narrow tube of water with a floating food reward just out of Cami, the crows figured out that dropping heavy objects into the water would raise the level and bring the food within reach. They then demonstrated they could distinguish between objects that would work and objects that wouldn't, choosing heavy items over light ones, solid objects over hollow ones, and high water tubes over low water ones. Their performance matched that of children aged 5 to 7. In 2024, researchers at a German institution achieved something entirely new. They trained crows to count out loud. Using a system of reward-based training, the crows learned to produce a specific number of vocalizations, 1 call, 2 calls, 3 calls, in correspondence with a visual number shown to them. This was not mimicry of a preset sound, but an active, on-demand production of a quantity-matched sequence of vocalizations. The ability to represent quantity through sound had previously been documented only in humans, suggesting that this seemingly abstract capacity may have roots in cognitive systems much older and more widespread than previously appreciated. American crows can reliably count to at least 3 or 4, a finding that comes from controlled experiments in which birds are shown specific quantities of objects and asked to respond in ways that demonstrate they can distinguish between 2 and 3, or 3 and 4. They also show rapid, flexible learning when symbols are paired with rewards. A crow that learns a certain shape means peanut. We'll generalize that association to slightly different versions of the shape, suggesting it has formed an abstract concept rather than just memorized a specific image. This symbolic associative learning is a foundational building block of more complex reasoning. Understanding analogies requires a mind capable of thinking about relationships between things, not just the things themselves. To say A is to B as C is to D requires grasping that there's a rule connecting A and B, and then applying that same rule to connect C and D even if C and D look nothing like A and B. Crows can do this. In experiments using images paired in specific relational patterns, crows demonstrated the ability to identify the rule linking one pair and then apply it to a novel pair they had never seen before. This capacity, called analogical reasoning, is one of the cognitive abilities that researchers long considered a hallmark of primate intelligence. A 2024 paper published in the journal Science Advances reported that crows can understand recursive sequences, the grammatical structure in which structures are embedded within other, similar structures. The example researchers used involved sequences of brackets, An open bracket must be matched by a close bracket, and nested sets of brackets must be matched from the outermost pair inward. Producing and recognizing these center-embedded sequences correctly requires tracking hierarchical relationships rather than just linear order. This kind of recursive processing is central to human grammar and has long been considered a uniquely human linguistic capacity. The crow data complicated that picture significantly. What made the recursion result particularly striking was that the crows performed the task without the extra training that comparison groups of monkeys had required. When given the same recursive sequence challenge, the crows produced correct center-embedded sequences on about 40% of trials, a rate comparable to that of young children given the same task. They didn't just learn a mechanical rule, they appeared to grasp the underlying structure of the sequences. Whether this indicates that recursion is more evolutionarily ancient than linguists believed, or that it evolved independently in corvids through convergent cognitive evolution, remains an open and fascinating question. Self-control, the ability to resist an immediate reward in favor of a larger or better reward later, is a capacity that requires holding a future state in mind while inhibiting a present impulse. It is closely associated with executive function, planning, and the kind of flexible, goal-directed behavior that characterizes cognitively sophisticated animals. Crows have been shown to possess genuine self-control in experimental settings. When offered a small reward immediately, or a better reward after a delay, they reliably choose to wait. This isn't infinite patience like humans and other animals. Crows have limits on how long they'll delay, but their capacity to resist impulse for future gain places them in a select cognitive category. Among the most compelling evidence for crow intelligence is their ability to remember not just where they hid food, but what they hid, and approximately when they hid it. This three-part what, where, when memory is called episodic, like memory, because it parallels the episodic memory system in humans, the ability to mentally revisit past events in their specific context. Crows have been shown to return preferentially to caches of high-quality food before that food degrades, suggesting they track not just location, but also the time elapsed since caching and the perishability of different food types. This is not simple spatial memory, it's a form of mental time travel. The social complexity of crow food caching behavior reaches its peak in the way crows manage their caches when other crows are present. If a crow is observed caching food by another crow, especially a higher-ranking individual, the observer will remember not just where the food was hidden, but who was watching. The caching crow, for its part, seems to know that it was observed and responds by returning later to relocate the food to a new hiding spot. But here's the subtlety. This relocation behavior only happens when the observer was dominant enough to pose a real threat. When the observer was subordinate or unlikely to steal, the crow didn't bother moving the cache. This level of social reasoning tracking who knows what and calibrating deception accordingly is extraordinary. The strategic cache relocation behavior in crows requires tracking not just the location of a cache, but a complex set of social variables. Who was present during caching, what their social status is relative to oneself, and therefore whether they represent a genuine threat. This isn't reflexive or instinctive, it's context-sensitive reasoning. Crows, without prior experience of having their own caches stolen, don't engage in this strategic deception. Only birds that have themselves been victims of theft develop the behavior, which suggests it is learned from direct experience rather than being hardwired, a striking example of learning from social context. The concept researchers call mental time travel in crows refers to the apparent ability to mentally project oneself into the past, to replay a specific event like caching food or into the future, to anticipate that a cache might be stolen and plan a countermeasure. Human mental time travel allows us to vividly relive memories and imagine future scenarios in rich detail. Whether crows experience anything like the subjective richness of human episodic memory is unknown and may not be knowable with current methods. But the behavioral evidence strongly suggests that crows are doing something far more sophisticated than simple conditioned response when they manage their food caches with this degree of strategic finesse. New Caledonian crows are native to the islands of New Caledonia, a French territory in the southwestern Pacific Ocean. And they have become among the most intensively studied birds on Earth because of their tool, user behavior so sophisticated that it has forced researchers to rethink assumptions about what kinds of cognitive abilities are required for technology. These crows don't occasionally pick up a stick when they need one. Tool use is a central, routine part of how they make their living. They manufacture their own tools, carry them from place to place, and adapt them to different tasks in ways that suggest genuine planning and physical understanding. In the forests of New Caledonia, these crows spend a significant portion of their foraging time using stick tools to probe into holes, crevices, and the chambers of decomposing logs in search of insect larvae and other invertebrates. To make a stick tool, a crow doesn't just grab the nearest twig. It selects a specific twig of appropriate diameter and length, then methodically strips away the leaves and side branches until only the smooth, uniform shaft remains. The finished tool is tested, adjusted if necessary, and sometimes carried considerable distances before use of behavior that suggests the crow has a goal in mind before it begins. Alongside their stick tools, New Caledonian crows manufacture leaf tools from the edges of pandanus plants, a genus of tropical shrub with long spine-edged leaves. The crow tears a strip from the leaf edge with great precision, producing a rectangular tool with naturally occurring barbs along one side. When the tool is held in a specific orientation with the barbs pointing toward the crow's beak, those barbs function as hooks. The crow can insert the tool into a crevice, maneuver it past an insect, and then withdraw the tool with the insect still clinging to the barbs. This design is genuinely sophisticated. The crow is using the plant's existing geometry as part of its engineering. In 2002, a captive New Caledonian crow named Betty became famous around the world for doing something that had never been observed before in a non-human animal. She took a straight piece of wire and bent it into a hook, then used that hook to retrieve a small bucket of food from inside a vertical tube. She was not trained to do this. She had not seen it done. She appeared to encounter the problem the food was out of reach with a straight wire and spontaneously devise a solution. The event was caught on video and published in the journal Science, and it sent a wave through the cognitive science and animal behavior communities that researchers are still feeling decades later. In 2018, researchers from the University of Oxford and Germany's Max Planck Institute for Ornithology designed a new kind of puzzle for New Caledonian crows, one that required them not just to use a tool, but to build one from separate components. The puzzle box contained food deep inside, reachable only with a tool long enough to push it to an exit. Short pieces were provided, individually too short to reach the food, but designed to fit together if the crow inserted one into another. Without any demonstration, without training, and on problems they had never encountered before, 4 of the 8 tested crows spontaneously combined the pieces into functional compound tools and retrieved the food. The compound tool result was significant not just because crows did it, but because of what doing it requires cognitively. To assemble 2 separately useless pieces into a single functional tool, the crow has to mentally represent the goal: reach the food, identify that the pieces individually won't work, recognize that the pieces could potentially be combined, figure out how to combine them, and then execute the assembly, all before seeing whether the approach works. The researchers described this as requiring anticipation of the affordances of tools to be built, essentially, imagining the properties of an object that doesn't yet exist. Prior to this study, such compound tool construction had been observed outside of humans, only in captive great apes. One New Caledonian crow in the compound tool study, nicknamed Mango by the researchers, didn't stop at two-piece tools. When the task was made harder by providing even shorter, more numerous pieces, Mango constructed compound tools from 3 and then 4 components. The tools fell apart several times during assembly, and each time, Mango patiently reconfigured and reassembled them until they worked. The researchers noted that this persistence and troubleshooting behavior, continuing to work toward a goal despite repeated setbacks, looked less like trial and error fumbling and more like a deliberate, goal-directed process. When researchers offered New Caledonian crows a task requiring meta-tool use, using one tool to obtain a different, better tool, which is then used to actually get the food 6 of 7 birds solved it on their very first attempt. The setup involved a short stick that could only reach a longer stick stored in a separate location, and only the longer stick could reach the food. The crow had to resist the temptation to immediately try using the short stick on the food where it wouldn't work, and instead use it on an intermediate step that didn't directly produce a reward. This requires suppressing an instinctive approach and engaging in Mazenda reasoning, a cognitive feat that had previously been documented only in primates. The unusual shape of the New Caledonian crow's lower mandible, which curves upward at the tip rather than pointing straight forward, has attracted the attention of evolutionary biologists who study the relationship between anatomy and behavior. The hypothesis is that this beak shape is not coincidental, but has been shaped over evolutionary time, specifically because it makes holding a tool easier and more stable. A beak that terminates in a slightly upturned tip can grip a stick or a wire at an angle that keeps the tool from slipping sideways during use, providing better control. If this hypothesis is correct, it means that tool use in this species is old enough and important enough to have literally shaped the bird's anatomy. The way New Caledonian crows make tools isn't uniform across the island. Different populations, even populations separated by relatively short distances on the same island, use noticeably different tool designs. Some populations favor plain, unmodified sticks. Others consistently produce tools with specific shapes, or prefer pandanus leaf tools over stick tools. Because these differences are consistent within populations but variable between them, and because young crows appear to learn their tool-making techniques by watching experienced adults, researchers interpret this pattern as cultural variation traditions transmitted socially from one generation to the next rather than genetically encoded. This makes New Caledonian crows one of the clearest non-human examples of material culture. American crows, despite living thousands of miles from their New Caledonian relatives and never having been observed using tools as a regular part of daily life, are fully capable of learning and applying tool use when the situation demands it. In laboratory experiments, American crows have picked up sticks and used them to retrieve food placed just out of reach, and they master water-level manipulation tasks, dropping objects into tubes to raise a pren, floating reward with impressive speed. The difference between American crows and New Caledonian crows isn't one of raw cognitive capacity so much as ecological necessity. American crows have enough food options that they've never needed to become specialist tool users. The underlying intelligence is there. It simply expresses itself differently. One of the most widely cited examples of crow ingenuity involves urban crows in Japan who figured out how to use passing cars as nutcrackers. In the 1990 ES, researchers documented American crows dropping hard-shelled walnuts onto road surfaces, waiting for vehicles to run over them and crack the shells, and then flying down to collect ES. the exposed knot meat. What elevated this from clever to genuinely remarkable was the next step. The crows learned to time their retrieval to coincide with red traffic lights, walking out to collect their food only when vehicle traffic had car. Stopped, and it was safe to do so. They were, in effect, using traffic infrastructure as both a tool and a timing system, a level of environmental problem-solving that continues to impress researchers. Northwestern crows living along the coastlines of the Pacific Northwest have developed a foraging technique that involves dropping shellfish mussels, clams, whelks from height onto rocks below to crack the shells and expose the soft tissue inside. What makes this particularly interesting is that the crows are not random about the height from which they drop items. Research has shown they adjust their dropping height based on the thickness and hardness of the shell, dropping thicker-shelled items from greater heights and lighter items from lower ones. This optimization, finding the minimum height needed to crack a given shell, minimizes the number of trips required and reduces the risk of losing the shell to competitors while maximizing foraging efficiency. Crows have 3 distinct methods for transporting food, and they select among them based on the size and nature of what they're carrying. Small items, a single peanut, a piece of bread. A beetle can be tucked into an extensible pouch at the base of the tongue and throat, a structure called the sublingual pouch, which allows the crow to carry food items without having to hold them in its bill. Medium-sized items are carried in the bill itself, held firmly during flight. Truly large items, a piece of roadkill, a large crab, a substantial chunk of food are occasionally transferred to the feet during flight, gripped by the talons the way a hawk carries prey. This flexible carrying system allows crows to transport a wide range of food efficiently across varying distances. After eating, crows don't digest everything they consume. The indigestible portions of a meal bone, fragments, insect exoskeletons, seed casings, eggshell pieces are compacted in the digestive system and eventually coughed up as compact pellets, typically 4 to 8 hours after eating. These pellets, similar to the more famous owl pellets, are a remarkably useful record of what a crow has consumed. Researchers who collect and dissect crow pellets can identify the remains of specific insects, seeds, and prey species, building a detailed picture of the bird's diet without ever needing to directly observe it. Feeding. The practice of pellet analysis has contributed substantially to what we know about crow dietary habits across different seasons and habitats. The balance between plant and animal food in a crow's diet shifts with the seasons, but on average, plant matter makes up roughly 72% of an adult American crow's annual diet, with animal matter accounting for the remaining 28%. This figure comes from one of the most comprehensive dietary studies ever conducted on any bird species, the analysis of more than 300 stomachs collected from adult American crows across the continental United States and Canada over the course of a full year. The plant-heavy balance might surprise people who think of crows primarily as scavengers, but it reflects the reality that grain, fruit, and seeds are abundant, energy-rich, and easy to obtain across much of the crow's range. Young crows in the nest, called nestlings, receive a diet radically different from the grain and fruit-heavy fare of adults. During the first weeks of life, nestlings are fed primarily animal matter: insects, earthworms, caterpillars, grubs, and other invertebrates that are rich in the proteins and fats needed to fuel rapid early growth. Parent crows and helpers pre-process this food, sometimes partially digesting it, sometimes softening it, before delivering it to the nestlings. The switch toward higher protein intake during the nestling phase mirrors what we see in many other highly intelligent species, where rapid early brain development creates an exceptional demand for protein-rich nutrition. The transition from nestling to fledgling happens with impressive speed in crows. Within roughly 4 weeks of hatching, a very short time for a bird with such a long and complex life ahead of it, young crows are physically ready to leave the nest. This rapid early development is one reason the nestling diet must be so protein-dense. The crow's body is essentially racing through the growth phase as quickly as biology allows. After fledging, the young birds continue to receive food from parents and helpers for months. But the urgency of the early growth phase is over, and the diet gradually shifts toward the more varied, opportunistic fare that adults eat. The sheer diversity of what crows will eat is one of their most ecologically significant characteristics. Researchers have documented more than 600 distinct food items consumed by American crows across different studies and populations. This list spans nearly every food category imaginable: insects and their larvae, spiders, millipedes, earthworms, frogs, lizards, snakes, eggs and nestlings of other birds, fish, carrion and roadkill, corn, wheat, oats, wild and cultivated fruits, nuts, berries, and an enormous variety of human food scraps ranging from French fries to dog kibble. This near-total dietary flexibility is a significant part of why crows are so successful in such a wide range of environments. There are very few places in the world where a crow cannot find something edible. In agricultural areas, crows consume impressive quantities of pest insects, grasshoppers, beetles, white grubs, and wireworms among them, all of which cause real economic damage to crops if left unchecked. This insect-eating role places crows in an interesting ecological position. They are simultaneously a pest species eating grain and corn directly, and a beneficial one reducing pest insect populations. Whether a crow population is net helpful or net harmful to a farmer depends heavily on the specific crops grown, the local insect community, and the time of year, a complexity that makes blanket policies toward crows difficult to justify scientifically. Despite their reputation as voracious scavengers, there are foods that crows cannot effectively access on their own. Small mammals like squirrels are a good example. Crows will eat squirrel meat readily, but they lack the bill strength to tear through the intact skin of a freshly dead squirrel. Their bills are simply not powerful enough to penetrate the hide. So crows that eat squirrels are almost invariably eating carcasses already opened by vehicles, larger predators, or decomposition. This limitation is a reminder that crow dietary flexibility, while genuinely impressive, does have physical boundaries set by the tool, the bill that they use to access food. Some crows have been observed deliberately softening hard or dry food by dunking it in water before eating, a behavior called food washing or food dunking. A crow that finds a dry piece of bread, for instance, may carry it to the nearest puddle or bird bath, dip it in the water, and then eat the softened result. This isn't simply a reflex response to thirst. It's an intentional food preparation behavior. The crow is modifying the physical properties of its food to make it more palatable or easier to swallow. The fact that crows engage in this kind of pre-consumption processing puts them in a very small group of animals that actively prepare their food rather than simply consuming it as found. Food caching, hiding food for future use, is a behavior that crows engage in regularly and with considerable sophistication. American crows have been documented caching fish, clams, frogs, corn, carrion, pecans, and many other foods, hiding them in trees, beneath snow, in soil, or under leaf litter. The cache site is chosen carefully, often in a location the crow can monitor from a distance. The crow remembers these sites with remarkable precision, returning to the right location days or weeks later to retrieve the stored food. This forward-planning behavior, setting aside resources for future consumption rather than eating everything immediately, is another cognitive feat that places crows in distinguished company. When a crow needs to cache a large food item like a frog or a sizable piece of carrion, it often doesn't hide the whole thing in one place. Instead, It dismembers the food into smaller pieces and distributes those pieces across multiple separate cache sites. This breeding strategy serves a clear purpose. If one cache is discovered and raided by a competitor, the entire meal isn't lost. Only one portion is compromised. The behavior requires the crow to mentally hold multiple cache locations simultaneously and to plan a hiding strategy before executing it, a form of distributed memory and spatial planning that is cognitively demanding for any animal. Outside of the breeding season, American crows living near large communal roosts may travel extraordinary distances as part of their daily routine, sometimes up to 40 miles in a single day, flying from the roost site to daytime foraging areas and then back again at dusk. These daily commutes follow established flight routes that crows appear to learn and maintain over time. The 40-mile figure is remarkable for a bird that weighs less than a pound. It represents a genuine investment of time and energy, and it means that the resources available within a 40-mile radius of a winter roost effectively become part of that roost community's daily food supply. When crows forage in groups, as they very frequently do, they don't simply all feed simultaneously with no coordination. One individual typically takes up a position on a raised perch nearby and watches the surrounding environment, while the others eat. This bird is functioning as a sentinel, scanning for approaching predators like hawks or owls, and ready to give an alarm call at the first sign of danger. The sentinel is usually a member of the family group, and its vigilance benefits not just the family, but also any nearby unrelated crows who happen to be foraging in the same area. The sentinel system is a form of collective defense that reduces individual risk without requiring complex negotiation. American crows have developed a wariness of roads and vehicles that helps them avoid being struck by traffic, even though they regularly forage along roadsides and highway margins for roadkill and discarded food. Studies of crow mortality have found that relatively few crows are hit by vehicles despite this constant proximity to traffic, far fewer than you might expect given how much time they spend near roads. Researchers attribute this to the crow's attentiveness. They consistently monitor approaching vehicles, gauge speed and trajectory, and move out of the way with well-timed precision. Juvenile crows are somewhat less skilled at this. They lack the experience of adults, which is one reason young birds face higher road-related mortality in their first year. American crows occupy an enormous geographic range across North America, present in virtually every habitat the continent offers, except the open tundra of the far north, where conditions are too harsh and dévolé. Food too scarce to support them year-round. Their range covers the continental United States, southern Canada from coast to coast, and extends south into northern Mexico. Within this range, crows are found in forests, farmland, suburbs, cities, wetlands, coastal areas, and mountains. This habitat generalism, the ability to thrive in many different environments, is a direct consequence of their dietary flexibility and cognitive adaptability, two traits that allow them to find food and solve problems wherever they settle. The global breeding population of American crows has been estimated at approximately 28 million birds by the organization Partners in Flight, which compiles population data for North Cree, American bird species. This figure places the American crow among the 5 most abundant bird species in the United States, a testament to how successfully this species has adapted to a continent dramatically reshaped by human activity over the past few centuries. Where many bird species have declined as forests were cleared and wetlands were drained, crows have generally benefited from the same landscape changes, finding new foraging opportunities in agricultural land, suburbs, and cities. Crow populations are not static entities. They rise and fall in response to disease, hunting, and environmental change. One of the most dramatic population shifts in recent American crow history was triggered by West Nile virus, which arrived in New York City in 1999 and spread rapidly westward, across the continent over the following years. Because crows are exceptionally susceptible to this mosquito-borne disease with mortality rates approaching 100% in infected individuals, before any natural resistance could develop, the virus had a devastating impact. Estimates suggest the overall US crow population declined by approximately 30% as a result, representing millions of birds lost over a relatively short period. West Nile virus is transmitted to crows through the bites of infected mosquitoes, particularly species in the genus Culex that feed on birds. Once a crow is infected, the virus moves through its body at alarming speed, causing neurological damage, organ failure, and death, typically within 4 days of infection. This rapid progression is part of what made early West Nile outbreaks so visible to the public. Crows were dying quickly and in large numbers in places where they were familiar and well observed, making the die-offs impossible to miss. Dead crows in the street became the public's first widespread indicator that West Nile had arrived in a new area. The scale of West Nile-related crow mortality was staggering in some areas. New York City alone lost close to 6,000 crows within just 4 months of the virus's first appearance in 1999. Research populations that had been carefully monitored for years by individual-level tagging were decimated. One study site in Oklahoma lost an estimated 72% of its marked population in a single year of West Nile exposure, including 82% of that year's juvenile birds. These weren't abstractions. They were birds with known ages, known family histories, and known behavioral profiles, vanishing from study sites in weeks. For over 2 decades after West Nile virus arrived in North America, a diagnosis of West Nile infection in an American crow was essentially a death sentence. The disease was so rapidly fatal, and crows so immunologically unprepared for it, that no confirmed survivals in wild birds were recorded. Then, in 2022, Cornell University's Wildlife Hospital documented something unprecedented. 5 American crows that had contracted West Nile virus were treated with supportive veterinary care and recovered well enough to be released back into the wild. It was the first confirmed evidence that survival was possible, and it opened a cautious door of hope for the long-term future of crow populations in areas where the virus is now endemic. The 5 crows that survived West Nile at Cornell received what veterinarians call supportive care treatment that helps the body fight a disease rather than directly attacking the pathogen itself, since no antiviral drug exists for West Nile. The birds received fluid therapy to keep them hydrated as fever and neurological symptoms progressed, be the term in supplementation to support the nervous system, and antiparasitic medication to reduce the burden of other infections that might compromise recovery. The fact that supportive care was sufficient to tip 5 birds from near-certain death to full recovery suggests that crows may have more latent immune capacity against West Nile than anyone suspected, a capacity that just needed enough time and support to express itself. Before the 2022 Cornell recoveries, the timeline for a crow with West Nile was brutally short. Birds that became infected typically showed neurological symptoms, disorientation, inability to fly, head tilting, tremors within days, and most died within 4 days of showing signs. This rapid collapse made West Nile fundamentally different from most infectious diseases, where some proportion of infected individuals managed to survive without treatment. The virus essentially outpaced the crow immune system's ability to mount a response, killing birds before their bodies had a chance to fight back. The Cornell survivals suggest that with enough external support during that critical window, the immune system can sometimes catch up. Dead crows have served a practical public health function since West Nile arrived in North America. Because crows die so rapidly and visibly from the disease, a sudden appearance of dead crows in an area provided public health officials with an early warning that infected mosquitoes were present. Surveillance programs in many states relied on reports from members of the public who found dead crows, collected and tested the carcasses, and used the results to map the geographic spread of the virus in real time. In many cases, crow deaths preceded the first human cases of West Nile in a given area by weeks, giving health authorities a brief window to ramp up mosquito control efforts. The transmission routes for West Nile virus in crow populations are somewhat more complex than a simple mosquito-to-bird chain. While the primary route is certainly mosquito bite, research has suggested that crows may also acquire the virus through consuming infected prey, particularly other birds that were themselves infected. This second-hand transmission route means that scavenging behavior, which is generally a survival advantage for crows, may occasionally increase disease risk. Raptors that eat infected birds have been shown to acquire West Nile this way, and given that crows eat a wide variety of animal foods, the same pathway likely applies to them. Adult American crows in the wild face relatively little predation pressure compared to many other bird species of similar size. Their wariness, their tendency to mob potential predators before those predators can get close, and their habit of roosting in large communal groups that provide many sets of eyes, all combine to make them difficult to catch. Great horned owls are the most effective crow predators, hunting at night when crows are roosting and vulnerable. Red-tailed hawks occasionally take crows during the day. Eagles will sometimes pursue them. But of all the potential sources of crow mortality documented in the historical record, intentional killing by humans has been by far the most significant accounting. For 68% of recovered crow bands from banded birds found dead between 1917 and 1999. The history of human attempts to control crow populations in North America is dramatic, and in retrospect, a study in the limits of persecution as a wildlife management strategy. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, crows were considered agricultural pests to be eliminated, and control efforts included dynamiting communal winter roosts events, in which hundreds of thousands of birds could be killed in a single night, as well as large-scale poisoning campaigns and organized communal braai. Hunts. Despite the deaths of millions of birds over decades, crow populations remained robust. Their high reproductive rate, dietary flexibility, and wide geographic distribution made them essentially impossible to suppress at a continental scale. American crows are protected under the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918A, law that prohibits the killing, capturing, selling, trading, or transporting of migratory birds without a BELA, federal permit. This protection covers all native migratory birds in the United States, and crows fall squarely within its scope. However, because crows can cause real damage to agricultural crops in some situations, the Act allows for managed hunting seasons that states can open under specific regulations. Crow hunting remains legal in many U.S. states today, typically during specified months and with bag limits, though it has declined substantially in popularity compared to earlier decades. Despite sustained hunting pressure across much of the 20th century and the devastating losses caused by West Nile virus beginning in 1999, American crow populations as a whole actually showed a slight increase between the mid-1960s and approximately 2019. According to data from the North American Breeding Bird Survey, one of the longest-running and most comprehensive bird monitoring programs in the world. This overall resilience in the face of significant mortality pressures reflects the crow's fundamental adaptability. High reproductive potential, dietary flexibility, and the ability to exploit new environments as they become available have consistently allowed crow populations to recover from setbacks that would devastate less adaptable species. While American crows as a species are doing well overall, the picture looks very different for some of their island-dwelling relatives. The Hawaiian crow, known in the Hawaiian language as the alala, was declared extinct in the wild in 2002 after the last wild individuals disappeared from the forests of the Big Island of Hawaii. The species survived only in captive breeding facilities, where conservationists worked for years to build up a population large enough to attempt reintroduction. The contrast between the thriving mainland American crow and the critically imperiled alala illustrates how profoundly different the conservation situations of closely related species can be when one lives on a continent and the other on an isolated island. The Mariana crow, known locally as the aga, is found only on the islands of Guam and Rota in the northern Mariana Islands. On Guam, its population has been devastated by the brown tree snake, an invasive predator accidentally introduced after World War, the second that wiped out most of Guam's native forest birds by raiding their nests and eating their eggs and chicks. The Mariana crow's slow reproductive rate, producing only 1 or 2 offspring per breeding season, means that even modest annual nest failure caused by snake predation is enough to drive the population steadily downward. Conservation efforts on Guam include aggressive snake control programs and the maintenance of snake-free refuges, but the crow remains critically endangered. The Banggai crow is one of the most obscure birds in the world. Confined to Banggai Island, a small island off the coast of Sulawesi in Indonesia, where it lives in a very small area of forest. So little is known about this species that even basic aspects of its biology, behavior, and population size are poorly documented. It represents one of many crow species that exist in the shadow of better-known relatives, studied infrequently and by few researchers, with conservation needs that are poorly understood because the data to assess them has never been systematically gathered. Its obscurity is itself a kind of vulnerability. The genus Corvus appears to have originated somewhere in Central Asia, with its ancestors derived from a broader Corvid lineage that itself had roots in Australia, making Australia, somewhat surprisingly, the ultimate evolutionary homeland of the crow family. From Central Asia, the ancestors of modern crows spread outward in multiple directions over millions of years, reaching North America across ancient land bridges, colonizing Africa and Europe through overland expansion, and island hopping across the Pacific to colonize New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, New Caledonia, and many other Pacific islands. This geographic radiation produced the remarkable diversity of crow species that exists today. The greatest concentration of crow species diversity in the world is found not in North America or Europe, where crows are most familiar to many people, but in the island archipelagos of Melanesia and Wallacea, the region encompassing New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, New Caledonia, and the many smaller island groups of the southwestern Pacific. Here, isolated islands provided separate evolutionary theaters where crow populations diverged from one another over millions of years, producing distinct species adapted to local conditions. South and Southeast Asia, East Africa, and Australia also harbor impressive crow diversity, each region having been colonized by ancestral corvids at different points in evolutionary history. The fossil record of corvids extends back approximately 17 million years to the mid-Miocene epoch, a time when the world was warmer than today. Grasslands were expanding across previously forested regions, and the mammalian fauna of most continents was very different from what we know now. The earliest corvid fossils come from Europe and include genera called Myocorvus and Myopica, some of which may be ancestral to modern crows and magpies, or may represent parallel evolutionary experiments that happen to produce similar forms through convergent evolution. Reconstructing the exact evolutionary relationships among these ancient corvids is difficult because many specimens are fragmentary. Genetic analysis published in 2012 using both nuclear and mitochondrial DNA from multiple Corvid species, placed the divergence of the American crow from the lineage leading to the carrion crow and hooded crow at approximately 5 million years ago during the Pliocene epoch. At that time, North America and Eurasia were still connected by the Bering Land Bridge during cold periods, allowing animal populations to move between the continents. The American crow's ancestors likely crossed into North America from Asia during one of these periods of continental connection, then evolved in isolation as the land bridge was repeatedly submerged and exposed by changing sea levels. The northwestern crow, long classified as a separate species, Corvus carinus, inhabiting the coastal Pacific Northwest from Washington State through coastal Alaska, was reclassified as a subspecies of the Endangered American crow following genetic studies that revealed extensive interbreeding between the two forms wherever their ranges overlapped. The genetic boundary between northwestern crows and Western American crows was blurry and inconsistent, a sign that the two populations had never been reproductively isolated long enough to develop the genetic distinctiveness that defines separate species. This reclassification illustrates how modern genetic tools have refined and sometimes overturned older taxonomic categories based solely on appearance and geography. The fish crow of the southeastern United States is a bird that looks almost identical to the American crow. At a glance, same size, same shape, same all-black plumage, but reveals itself the moment it opens its beak. Where the American crow produces a clear, resonant caw, the fish crow gives a noticeably more nasal, almost questioning sound, often described as a short, high-pitched or ka, rather than a full, round caw. This vocal difference is so reliable that experienced birders in areas where both species occur primarily along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, and increasingly inland, use sound alone to identify them, rarely needing to see the bird to know which species they're dealing with. The hooded crow, found across northern and eastern Europe and into parts of the Middle East and Central Asia, is one of the most visually distinctive members of the entire Corvus genus. While most crows are uniformly dark, the hooded crow wears a striking two-tone outfit. Its head, wings, tail, and throat are glossy black, while its body, the breast, belly, and back, is a soft, pale gray. From a distance, a hooded crow can look almost like a completely different kind of bird. Despite this dramatic visual difference from the all-black carrion crow, the two species are closely related and, where their ranges meet in a narrow transition zone across Europe, interbreed to produce hybrid offspring. The pied crow of sub-Saharan Africa stands out visually among African corvids with its bold black and white coloration, a glossy black head, wings, and tail contrasting sharply with a clean white breast and a broad white patch across the nape and upper back. It inhabits open landscapes, savanna edges, coastlines, and the margins of human settlements across a broad swath of Africa from coastal West and Central Africa down to the southern tip of the continent. In ecological terms, the pied crow fills much the same niche in African landscapes that the carrion crow fills in European ones: an intelligent, adaptable omnivore, comfortable around human activity, and capable of exploiting a wide range of food sources. The large-billed crow of Eastern Asia is not just one bird, but 9 recognized subspecies, each with its own range, and each showing subtle but consistent differences in bill size, body size, vocalization, and genetic profile. This subspecific complexity makes the large-billed crow one of the most taxonomically complicated members of the genus, and ongoing genetic research continues to refine our understanding of exactly how these populations relate to one another. The species as a whole ranges across a vast geographic area from the Himalayas through China, Japan, and Southeast, into the Indonesian archipelago, making it one of the most widely distributed corvids in grass. Asia. The Cape crow of eastern and southern Africa has evolved a beak unlike that of most of its relatives, long, slim, and gently curved, adapted specifically for probing deep into soil and substrate in search of prey. Invertebrates. While most crows use their bills as general-purpose tools for tearing, pecking, and manipulating a wide variety of foods, the Cape crow's bill is more specialized, functioning like a narrow probe that can reach into crevices and earth tunnels where insect larvae and earthworms hide. Despite its alternative common name, Cape rook, it is not closely related to the Eurasian rook. The similar name reflects a superficial resemblance rather than a genuine evolutionary relationship. The little crow of Western and Central Australia is a bird of the arid interior, a specialist of dry, sun-scorched landscapes where resources are sparse and unpredictable. Unlike many of its corvid relatives, the little crow is not primarily a scavenger. It takes most of its diet from insects and seeds gleaned from the ground and from cultivated agricultural lands in the small rural towns scattered across the Australian interior. It lives and forages in flocks, often quite large ones, which help it locate food in the patchy, variable landscape and provide protection against the relatively few predators that live in its desert and semi-desert mass. Habitat. American crows are cooperative breeders, meaning that in a majority of crow families, the breeding pair does not raise their young alone. Instead, offspring from previous years' birds that are now 1, 2, 3, or even more years old remain with their parents and actively help raise the next generation. These helpers bring food to the nest, guard the nestlings against predators, join in the mobbing of threats, and maintain the family territory. This kind of multi-generational family assistance is relatively rare among birds. Only a small percentage of bird species worldwide have evolved it, but in American crows it is the norm rather than the exception. The scale of crow family cooperation can be genuinely impressive. In a long-term study conducted in Tompkins County, New York by researcher Kevin McGowan and colleagues at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, individual crow family groups were found to sometimes include as many as 15 birds, simultaneously a breeding pair plus offspring from as many as 5 different previous breeding seasons, all living together and interacting as a coherent social unit. Tracking these families over years revealed a rich social world in which individuals had specific relationships, roles, and histories with one another more like a multi-generational human family than what most people would picture when they think of birds. The prevalence of helpers in American crow nests is striking. In Macy Gowan's long-term New York study population, approximately 80% of all observed nests had at least one helper present a non-breeding bird actively contributing to the nesting effort. This near-universal presence of helpers in crow nests suggests that helping is not an unusual or marginal behavior in this species, but rather a deeply embedded social strategy. For the helpers themselves, there are likely multiple benefits: gaining experience raising young, maintaining access to a safe and established territory, and potentially inheriting the breeding position when the current breeder dies or declines. Female American crows typically begin breeding at an average age of 3.3 years, while males average 4.9 years before their first breeding attempt. These are not the ages at which the birds become physically capable of breeding. They could likely breed earlier, but the ages at which they actually succeed in obtaining a territory and a mate. The delay reflects the intense competition for breeding positions in established crow populations, where suitable territories are already occupied by experienced breeders. Young birds who cannot immediately find an opening stay on as helpers, biding their time and gaining experience while waiting for a vacancy to appear. Crow nest success. The probability that a given nesting attempt will produce at least one fledgling averages around 60%, in studied American crow populations. This means that about 2 out of every 5 nesting attempts fail entirely, usually due to predation, weather events, or starvation of the nestlings. The primary predators of crow nests in North America are great horned owls, which are large enough and aggressive enough to take on a mob of defending adult crows if they find a nest at night. Red-tailed hawks and raccoons, which are skilled climbers capable of reaching nests in trees that most ground predators couldn't access. When crow nesting attempts do succeed, they don't always produce large numbers of offspring. Successful American crow nests fledge an average of about 1. 8 young birds, fewer than 2 per nest, reflecting the fact that even in successful nests, some eggs may fail to hatch, or some nestlings may die before. Fledging. Per successful nest, the figure rises to about 3.2 fledglings, which represents the output when at least 1 chick survives. Of those fledglings, only about half survive to reach their first breeding season, meaning the effective reproductive output of a breeding pair in any given year is often less than 1 reproductively successful offspring. Crows are not birds that set up a permanent nest and use it for years the way some large birds do. American crows typically build a fresh nest each year, even if they return to the same territory, and often to the same general area within that territory. The old nest from a previous year may still be visible in the tree, sometimes just a few meters from the new construction, but the birds invest the time and energy to build a new one rather than simply renovating. The construction process takes 8 to 14 days and involves both members of the breeding pair, often with help from previous year offspring who carry materials to the site, while the breeding female does much of the finer bikintar. Assembly work. Crow nests are built high in trees, almost always in the upper third of the tree's height, and are positioned either in a crotch where a branch joins the trunk, or at the base of a sturdy lateral branch close to the trunk. Both locations provide the structural support needed to hold a nest that can be quite substantial in size. The outer frame of the nest is constructed from medium to large twigs, many of which the crow breaks directly off nearby trees rather than collecting from the ground. The inner cup is lined with progressively softer materials: pine needles, dried grass, shredded bark, moss, or animal hair, creating a warm, cushioned bowl for the eggs and nestlings. During the weeks spanning nest construction, egg laying, and incubation, a period of roughly a month breeding American crows undergo a dramatic behavioral change. These normally loud, conspicuous, socially active birds become quiet and secretive around the nest site, moving to and from it discreetly and avoiding the loud calling that characterizes most of their daily life. This behavioral shift is thought to reduce the risk of drawing the attention of nest predators like hawks and raccoons. The contrast is striking enough that experienced crow watchers use sudden crow quietude in a familiar area as one of the best clues that nesting has begun nearby. Only female crows incubate the eggs. This is confirmed not just by behavioral observation, but by anatomy. Only female crows develop brood patches, specialized areas of bare, heavily vascularized skin on the belly and breast that come into direct contact with the eggs and transfer body heat to them. Males simply don't develop these structures. The brood patch forms each breeding season in response to hormonal changes and then refeathers after incubation ends. Reports in older ornithological literature suggesting that male crows sometimes incubate appear to have been based on misidentification or unverified accounts. And more careful, modern studies have consistently confirmed female-only incubation in this species. Crow eggs are beautifully marked. The ground color of an American crow egg is typically olive green to blue-green, a color that blends reasonably well with the shadowy interior of a nest and the dappled light filtering through tree canopy. Over this base color, the eggs are covered with irregular blotches and spots of gray-brown, concentrated most densely toward the wider end of the egg. Individual eggs vary in shape, from more rounded to more elliptical, and even within the same clutch, eggs can differ noticeably in size and exact coloration. Each egg measures roughly 2.6 to 3.1 centimeters in length, about the size of a large grape. American crow clutches average 4 to 6 eggs per nesting attempt, though the range across the genus Corvus more broadly runs from as few as 3 to as many as 9. The eggs in a clutch are not all laid at the same time. The female lays 1 egg per day until the clutch is complete, and incubation typically begins before all the eggs are laid, usually starting around the time the third egg appears. This early start to incubation means that the first eggs to be laid have a head start in development, so the first chick hatches before the last egg is even finished incubating. Within a clutch of 4 to 5 eggs, the first and last chick to hatch may differ by about 3 days in age. The hatching interval within a crow clutch, the spacing between when the first and last eggs hatch, creates a size hierarchy among siblings that can have real consequences for survival. The first hatched nestlings are larger, stronger, and better positioned to compete for food from the moment they emerge. Last hatched nestlings enter a nest already occupied by siblings with a head start. And in years when food is scarce, the smallest nestlings may not receive enough to survive. This is not an accident of biology. It is thought to be an evolved mechanism that allows parents to match the number of chicks they raise to the amount of food available in any given year, with the smallest nestlings serving as insurance offspring that survive when conditions are good and perish when they are not. Young crows leave the nest surprisingly quickly. Within 25 to 35 days of hatching, they are physically ready to fledge, making their way from the nest cup to nearby branches and beginning to explore the immediate surroundings. In the first days after leaving the nest, fledgling crows are not yet capable of sustained flight. They can flutter and glide between nearby perches, but cannot fly confidently. They spend up to 10 days in this semi-arboreal state, perched in the canopy, calling loudly for food, and gradually building the wing strength and coordination needed for true flight. During this vulnerable period, parents and helpers remain close and highly vigilant. After fledglings achieve full flight, typically within a week or two of leaving the nest, they remain closely attached to their family group and continue to receive supplemental food from parents and helpers for an extended period. The intensity of parental feeding gradually decreases through the summer months, but young crows from some populations are still receiving food from adults as late as the end of August, roughly 4 months after hatching. This extended period of parental support allows young crows to develop their own foraging skills at a relatively low-risk pace, practicing problem-solving and food acquisition with a safety net of adult provisioning beneath them. Male American crows court females through a physical display that is both subtle and charming. The displaying male approaches the female closely, fluffs his body feathers outward to make himself look larger and rounder, spreads his wings and tail slightly, and bobs his head rhythmically up and down. Throughout this display, he produces a quiet, rattling song, a subdued, complex vocalization quite unlike the loud calls of everyday crow communication. This soft song is rarely heard except in the context of courtship, making it one of the more intimate and easily overlooked aspects of crow behavior. Mated pairs that have been together for years rarely engage in elaborate courtship displays, since the bond is already established. The bond between a mated crow pair is maintained not just through breeding, but through constant physical proximity and mutual grooming throughout the year. Mated pairs perch in close contact, touch and cross their bills, a gesture called billing and preen each other's feathers in the areas that are difficult to reach alone, like the back of the head and the nape of the neck. This mutual preening, called allopreening, keeps feathers in good condition, but also serves a social function. It reinforces the pair bond and communicates trust and affiliation between individuals. In crow pairs that have been together for many years, This kind of quiet physical contact is a routine part of daily life. American crows form long-term pair bonds that can last for the entirety of both birds' lives, a commitment to a single partner that biologists call monogamy. When one member of a mated pair dies, the survivor does not immediately pair with a new partner. There may be a period during which the widowed bird returns to a helper role or spends time as a solitary individual before eventually forming a new bond. This pattern of mate fidelity, combined with the multi-generational family structure that crow groups maintain, creates a social world with a depth and continuity of relationship that researchers find genuinely striking in a wild bird. Despite their reputation for lifelong fidelity, American crows do engage in extra-pair copulation matings between individuals who are not each other's primary partners. Genetic analysis of crow nestlings has revealed that not all chicks in a nest are necessarily the offspring of the resident male, even when that male is present, attentive, and apparently faithful. Extra-pair paternity in crows is not as common as in some other socially monogamous bird species, but it does occur, adding a layer of genetic complexity to the family groups that behavioral observation alone would debullize, not reveal. For the female, extra-pair mating may increase the genetic diversity of her offspring for the male. It represents a potential genetic cost he may not even be aware of. As summer transitions to autumn and the breeding season ends, American crow family groups begin to merge with neighboring groups, and those merged groups join with others. And the process continues through the fall in a gradual social aggregation that ends in the massive communal roosts of winter. The largest of these winter roosts, documented at several locations across the United States, have contained hundreds of thousands to several million birds, all gathering in the same area at dusk to spend the night together. These roosts are among the most spectacular wildlife events that take place in North America, yet they occur largely without fanfare in towns and cities across the continent. The Fort Cobb area of western Oklahoma has long hosted one of the most impressive communal crow roosts ever documented in North America. Each winter, crows from surrounding regions converge on this area in numbers that have been estimated at several million birds, a gathering so large that the noise, movement, and sheer visual impact of the roosting birds can be experienced from considerable distances. These aggregations are not random or accidental. They represent the endpoint of a daily social assembly process in which crows from many different family groups and foraging areas gradually merge as the afternoon light fades. Drawn together by a combination of learned tradition, social attraction, and the practical benefits of roosting in large numbers. Some communal crow roost sites have been used continuously for more than a century, not by the same individual birds, obviously, since no crow lives that long, but by successive generations of crows who learned the location of the roost from their parents and passed that knowledge on to their own offspring. In some areas, local records document the same grove of trees being used as a winter crow roost year after year, going back well over 100 years. With the population of roosting birds fluctuating in size depending on local conditions, but the site itself remaining a consistent focal point. This cultural transmission of roost location knowledge passed from one generation to the next through social learning rather than genetic inheritance is one of the quieter but more remarkable aspects of crow social bar. Life. The advantages of roosting in large communal groups are several, and researchers have proposed various explanations for why crows have evolved this behavior despite the noise, competition, and conspicuousness it breed. Involves. Safety from predators is the most straightforward benefit. A roost of thousands of birds has thousands of pairs of eyes, dramatically reducing the chance that an approaching owl can reach any single bird before the alarm is creaked. Raised. Shared body warmth on cold nights provides another real advantage, particularly for smaller or younger birds who might otherwise struggle to maintain body temperature. And the roost may also function as an information exchange, a place where birds can observe which individuals departed in the morning, looking healthy and well-fed, potentially following them to productive foraging areas the next day. Cities have become increasingly attractive as winter roost sites for American crows, a shift that began in earnest in the 1960s and has accelerated since. Several factors make urban environments appealing. The urban heat island effect, the phenomenon by which cities are measurably warmer than surrounding rural areas due to the heat retained by buildings, pavement, and human activity means that roosting crows in a city may experience temperatures 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than crows roosting in a nearby rural forest. Artificial lighting from street lamps, buildings, and parking lots also helps crows detect approaching owls during the night, providing a safety benefit that rural roost sites simply cannot offer. When crow roosts establish themselves in heavily populated urban areas, the response from human communities is often mixed. The noise of thousands of crows calling as they settle in for the night, the accumulation of droppings on cars, sidewalks, and buildings beneath roost trees, and concerns about disease transmission have led many municipalities to attempt to disperse large urban roosts. The methods used pyrotechnics, laser devices, recordings of crow distress calls. Even trained falconry birds can temporarily move a roost from one location to another, but rarely eliminate it entirely. Crows disturbed from one roost site typically relocate to a nearby area with similar characteristics, rather than abandoning the general vicinity. The daily rhythm of a crow's life during the winter roosting season follows a consistent pattern. At dawn, the massive roost dissolves as birds depart in waves, streaming outward from the roost site in all directions along established flight paths to their daytime foraging areas. Throughout the morning and afternoon, smaller groups of 4 to 7 birds, typically family units, forage within their established territories, probing fields, investigating roadsides, and picking through whatever foods sources the season offers. As the afternoon light begins to fade, these small groups begin moving back toward the roost, joining larger and larger aggregations of birds along the way until the full roost reassembles for the night. Crow territories during the breeding season are actively and vigorously defended spaces. A breeding pair, typically accompanied by one or more helpers from previous years, maintains exclusive control over a defined area that includes the nest site, important foraging locations, and key perching. Trees. Any intrusion by neighboring crows, potential predators, or unfamiliar animals triggers a defensive response that can escalate from loud calling to active pursuit and physical harassment. The family group works as a coordinated unit in territory defense, with helpers contributing to the mobbing and chasing that drives away intruders, a collective effort that makes the defended territory substantially more secure than a pair could maintain alone. Mobbing, the behavior in which multiple crows join together to harass a predator through a combination of loud alarm calling, close aerial pursuit, dive bombing, and sustained harassment, is one of the most dramatic and effective defensive strategies in the crow behavioral repertoire. When a great horned owl is discovered roosting in a tree within crow territory, for example, the discovering crow's alarm calls can attract dozens of additional crows within minutes, all contributing to the harassment timah of the predator. The mobbing typically continues until the predator flies away, which it usually does, since the constant noise and physical harassment make it essentially impossible to rest or hunt effectively. Crows are rarely seriously injured during mobbing. They maintain a safety distance, but the cumulative pressure is sufficient to move most predators. Crows learn to recognize specific individuals as dangerous through direct experience, and this recognition is both precise and long-lasting. The famous University of Washington experiments led by John Marsworth and his students demonstrated this with elegant clarity. Researchers captured and banded American crows while wearing specific rubber masks caricature-like human faces to conceal their identities. In the days and weeks following capture, crows began scolding, dive-bombing and mobbing any person wearing that same mask on the university campus, while ignoring people wearing different masks or no mask at all. The crows had formed a specific lasting memory of a particular face associated with a threatening experience. What made the mask experiment even more revealing was what happened next. Crows that had never been captured, birds that had simply observed the harassment of the F. Dangerous masked humans by other crows also began to respond negatively to the dangerous mask. They had learned which face to fear not through personal experience, but through social observation. This rapid spread of threat information through a crow community mirrors the kind of cultural transmission of knowledge that we recognize as a defining feature of human societies. The crows were, in effect, teaching each other which individuals to treat with suspicion. The persistence of face recognition in crows is extraordinary, even by the standards of intelligent animals. By 2013, 17 full years after the initial captures in Maslow's ongoing study, the dangerous mask was still eliciting scolding responses from crows on the University of Washington campus. Though the intensity of the response had gradually declined as the original captured birds aged, died, and were replaced by younger generations with less direct knowledge of the threat. The gradual fading of the response over decades, tracking the turnover of the bird population, gave researchers a unique window into how socially transmitted threat information persists and eventually dissipates as the individuals who learned it firsthand are no longer present. The neutral mask in Maslow's Study the Face, modeled on then Vice President Dick Cheney, worn by researchers who fed crows and behaved benignly, was never scolded. Crows wearing the neutral mask could walk through areas populated by crows that were aggressively scolding the dangerous mask, and receive no aggressive response whatsoever. This clean separation between the two masks in the crows' responses confirmed that the birds were making a specific, individual-level recognition rather than a generalized wariness of masked humans as a category. They had formed distinct mental representations of distinct faces, each associated with a different history of interaction. The acoustic structure of crow calls encodes information about the individual producing them, information subtle enough that human ears typically cannot detect it without acoustic analysis equipment, but that crows can apparently pass with ease. Research has shown that crow calls vary consistently between individuals in ways that reflect the caller's sex, their identity as an individual, and the behavioral context in which the call is being produced. A sophisticated listener, meaning another crow, not a human, can theoretically extract from a single call the information that this particular individual of this sex, in this social context, is producing this call. It is a remarkably dense communication channel. Large-billed crows have been shown in carefully designed experiments to link the voice of a specific group member to that individual's face, a capacity called cross-modal recognition. The experimental setup was elegant. A crow would be shown a familiar group member visually, and then hear either that individuals call a match or a different group members call a mismatch. When the voice and face didn't match, the crow looked more rapidly toward the source of the sound and maintained its gaze for longer, the same kind of expectancy violation response that human infants show when they see a face that doesn't match a voice they've been hearing. The crows had formed integrated mental representations that linked specific voices to specific identities. American crows have demonstrated the ability to respond differently to speakers of different human languages, not by understanding the content of what is said, but by detecting phonological differences between languages. In research comparing crow responses to Japanese and Dutch speakers, crows showed differential responses that couldn't be explained by differences in the speaker's physical appearance or behavior, suggesting the birds were actually processing and distinguishing the acoustic properties of the two languages. This cross-language discrimination suggests that crow auditory processing is sensitive to phonological patterns at a level of detail that goes well beyond simple loudness or pitch. The information carried in a crow's core extends well beyond simple presence or alarm. Acoustic studies have shown that even within the single familiar core sound, there are variations in pitch, duration, repetition rate, interval length, and tonal quality that encode meaningful information about the caller's identity, sex, and current situation. Researchers analyzing recordings of crow calls with spectrographic equipment have found these variations to be both consistent within individuals across different recording sessions and distinctive enough between individuals to allow individual identification from voice alone, a kind of avian voice print. This means that when a crow hears a familiar neighbor call, it is receiving a packet of information far richer than the simple fact that another crow is present. American crows produce a repertoire of more than 20 distinct call types, each associated with specific communicative functions and social contexts. Beyond the familiar core, which itself varies enormously in form and meaning depending on how it is delivered, crows produce rattles, clicks, coos, soft knocking sounds, and a variety of other vocalizations that serve different purposes in different situations. Some of these calls are heard only rarely. The intimate rattle call, for example, is exchanged primarily between mates or very close associates, almost never directed at unfamiliar birds. Others, like certain alarm calls, are produced loudly and at high repetition rates specifically to broadcast information to as wide an audience as possible. The two broad categories of crow vocalization: contextual calls tied to specific events, and non-contextual companion calls that maintain contact without signaling anything particular function, differently in the crow's communicative world. Companion calls are the acoustic equivalent of background conversation. They tell other crows where you are and that you're present, without flagging any specific situation that requires a response. Contextual calls, by contrast, demand attention and action. When a crow produces an intense, erratic, rapidly escalating burst of calls while staring at a specific location, every nearby crow stops what it's doing and looks toward that location because the call's structure signals that something specific and potentially important is happening there. The graduated nature of crow alarm calls, the way their acoustic structure shifts as a threat intensifies, means that the calls carry not just binary danger/no danger information, but something more like a continuous update on threat level and proximity. A slow, measured series of calls directed toward a distant hawk carries a different urgency than a rapid, irregular burst directed at that same hawk as it begins to approach. And when the threat is close enough that hiding rather than mobbing becomes the better strategy, the call type changes again, shifting to a qualitatively different vocalization that prompts other crows to take cover rather than converge. This multi-level alarm system provides nuanced, real-time threat information to every crow within earshot. The way crows respond to the alarm calls of other bird species reveals the breadth of their social information network. Crows don't live in a world made up only of other crows. They share their environment with dozens of other bird species, many of which have their own alarm call systems. Research has documented that crows respond appropriately to the alarm calls of several other species, adjusting their behavior based on whether the alarm indicates a ground predator, an aerial predator, or a double-IR, disturbance of intermediate threat level. A Stella's J alarm call near a roosting owl, for instance, will bring crows to the site. In minutes, the crows have learned to treat J alarms as reliable indicators of owl presence, even when they haven't directly observed the owl themselves. Crow vocal mimicry, the ability to reproduce sounds from the environment including human speech, is possible because of the highly flexible musculature of the syrinx, the bird's vocal organ, which allows fine control over a wide range of acoustic parameters. In captivity, crows exposed regularly to human speech can learn to reproduce recognizable words and short phrases, though they do so less clearly and less readily than parrots, which are specialized vocal mimics. Wild crows occasionally produce mimicry of other bird species or mechanical environmental sounds, though this is less common than in some other corvid species like ravens and jackdaws. The mimicry ability itself may serve social functions, helping crows integrate sounds from their environment into their communicative repertoire. The syrinx of a crow is a remarkable instrument, a paired structure located at the point where the trachea divides into the two bronchi leading to the lungs. Unlike the human larynx, which produces sound on a single channel, the crow's syrinx has two sides that can be controlled largely independently, allowing the bird to produce two different sounds simultaneously or to create complex acoustic modulations that no single-channel vocal apparatus could achieve. This anatomical arrangement is what makes the full range of crow vocalizations possible, and it is shared in various forms by all songbirds, which is part of what defines the group technically as Oscines. In 2025, research on carrion and hooded crow vocalizations revealed that their call sequences adhere to Menzerath's law, a statistical principle originally identified in human language that describes a relationship between the length of a linguistic unit and the length of its constituent parts. In human language, for example, longer sentences tend to contain shorter words, and longer words tend to contain shorter syllables. The discovery that crow call sequences follow the same statistical law suggests that the pressures driving efficient communication, minimizing the acoustic, effort needed to convey information across a given communicative distance may produce similar structural patterns in very different communication systems, regardless of whether those systems are used by humans or birds. Researchers have begun applying artificial intelligence tools, particularly machine learning algorithms trained on large libraries of crow vocalizations, to the problem of decoding what crows are communicating. Human ears and conventional acoustic analysis can identify gross categories of crow calls fairly reliably, but the subtle variations within call types that appear to carry individual identity, social context, and situational information are too fine-grained for traditional analysis methods to resolve. Machine learning approaches, which can detect patterns across thousands of recordings simultaneously, are beginning to reveal structure in crow vocalizations that researchers had long suspected was present, but couldn't directly access. The early results suggest that crow calls are considerably more information-rich than even optimistic researchers had assumed. The fission-fusion social structure of crow populations in which individuals regularly split apart and come back together, moving fluidly between small family groups and large communal aggregations depending on the time of day and season, places heavy cognitive demands on individual birds. To navigate this social world effectively, a crow must maintain updated mental models of many different individuals: who they are, what their social rank is, what their recent behavior has been, and what the crow's own history of interaction with each of them looks like. This kind of social bookkeeping, across a shifting cast of dozens or hundreds of individuals, is cognitively expensive, and many researchers believe it was precisely this social complexity that drove the evolution of Corvid intelligence. The social complexity of crow life creates conditions where individual recognition, reputation tracking, and relationship management become genuinely important to survival and reproduction. A crow that can accurately remember which individuals it can trust, which ones have stolen from its caches before, which ones are reliable allies in territory defense, and which ones to approach cautiously at food sources, will be better positioned than one that treats all individuals equivalently. This kind of differentiated social knowledge, knowing not just that others exist, but who they specifically are and what their history is one of the hallmarks of what cognitive scientists call social intelligence. And crows display it in abundance. When a crow discovers a dead member of its species, the sequence of events that follows is remarkably consistent across different populations and different contexts. The discovering crow produces a distinctive alarm call, not the same call it would use for a hawk or a fox, but a call specifically associated with the presence of a dead crow, and this call recruits other crows rapidly to the site. Within minutes, a group of birds has assembled nearby, perching in surrounding trees and on the ground. For a period of roughly 15 to 20 minutes, the assembled crows alternate between near silence, during which they appear to be closely observing the carcass and its surroundings, and explosive bursts of loud camber, calling. Then, almost simultaneously, the gathered birds depart. The functional explanation for crow funeral behavior that has received the most scientific support treats these gatherings as collective threat assessment events rather than mourning rituals. Behavioral ecologist Kaylee Swift, working at the University of Washington under John Maslow, conducted controlled experiments in which she presented crows with taxidermied crow carcasses in various conditions and locations and carefully measured the crow's behavioral and physiological responses. Her findings supported the hypothesis that crows gather around dead conspecifics primarily to gather information. Specifically, to assess whether whatever killed the dead crow represents an ongoing threat in that location that the living crows should avoid. The brain imaging component of Swift's crow funeral research added a neurological dimension to the behavioral findings. Using PET scans taken from crows immediately after they were shown a dead crow, Swift and Maslow found that the site of a dead conspecific activated regions of the crow brain associated with complex decision-making and social processing, not the simpler fear response regions that activate in response to a direct predator threat. This neural signature suggested that crows were engaging in higher-order processing when confronted with a dead fellow crow, thinking GA carefully and flexibly about what the death meant and how to respond, rather than simply reacting with a pre-programmed alarm response. After encountering a dead crow and the person or situation associated with it, individual crows showed elevated wariness toward that specific person in subsequent days, approaching them less closely, calling at them more, and maintaining greater vigilance in their presence. This lingering behavioral change confirms that the funeral gathering is not just a momentary reaction, but generates lasting memories that shape future behavior. In effect, the crow funeral is a learning event, an opportunity for every attending bird to update its model of the world with new information about threats and dangerous locations, information that will influence its behavior for days or weeks afterward. Crows are genuinely playful animals, and the evidence for this is not just anecdotal. Researchers studying Corvid behavior have formally documented 7 distinct categories of play behavior in crows and their close relatives: locomotor play, object play, social play, vocal play, and several others, each representing a different way that crows engage in behavior that serves no immediate survival function, but that appears to be intrinsically rewarding in itself. Play in birds is exceptionally rare, observed in only about 25 of the roughly 500 bird species currently recognized by science. The fact that crows are among that small group places them in remarkably distinguished company, alongside parrots, hornbills, and a handful of other cognitively sophisticated bird families. One of the most widely viewed pieces of evidence for crow play is a video recorded in Russia showing a hooded crow repeatedly using the inside of a jar lid as a sled on a snow-covered rooftop. The crow would position itself on the lid at the top of the roof, slide down the slope, pick up the lid, fly back to the top, and repeat the process, doing this multiple times in sequence with no apparent goal other than the sliding itself. The crow was not retrieving food, not escaping a predator, not competing with another bird. It was, by any reasonable interpretation of the behavior, playing using a found object as a toy in a way that generated a repeated, self-reinforcing activity. The video has been watched by millions of people and remains one of the most compelling pieces of behavioral evidence for avian play. Locomotor play in crows takes many forms beyond sliding. Groups of crows have been observed on windy days lining up along the ridge of a building or the edge of a cliff, taking turns launching themselves into an updraft, riding it back to their starting position, and then repeating the preceding bow. Sequence. This behavior, wind riding for apparent enjoyment, has been documented by multiple observers in multiple locations and appears to be a genuinely recreational use of aerial dynamics. The birds show no sign of foraging, territorial behavior, or social signaling during these episodes. They simply queue up and take turns flying into the wind, which is about as close to a crow theme park ride as the natural world offers. Juvenile crows are particularly enthusiastic players, and watching a group of young crows in late summer when fledglings have gained enough flight skill to explore their environment but haven't yet taken on the more serious responsibilities of adult life can be remarkably entertaining. Young crows wrestle with each other on the ground, tumbling and grappling in ways that look genuinely rough, but that researchers describe as mutually consented social play rather than genuine aggression. They steal objects from each other, pull each other's tail feathers, and chase each other through trees and across open ground in games of aerial pursuit. These juvenile play sessions are thought to serve important developmental functions, building physical skills, developing social bonds, and learning how to navigate complex social interactions in a low-stakes park. Context. Crow play extends naturally into interactions with other species, and these cross-species play events have been documented in enough context to suggest they represent genuine play rather than territorial or predatory behavior. Crows have been filmed repeatedly dive-bombing dogs in what appears to be deliberate provocation, swooping in, tugging a tail or ear, and then retreating to a safe perch before the dog can respond, only to swoop in again moments later. Crows are being documented landing on the backs of resting cattle and sliding off, then doing it again. They have been filmed playing keep away with dogs, holding objects just out of reach, and dropping them only when the dog moves away. These interactions suggest that crows find other species' responses interesting and entertaining in their own right. Local play in young crows represents a particularly interesting parallel to human development. Ornithologists and Corvid researchers have observed juvenile crows sitting alone on branches and producing long, rambling sequences of sounds, combinations of caws, rattles, clicks, coos, and mimicked environmental sounds, apparently directed at no one in particular, with no obvious communicative goal. This kind of solitary, exploratory vocalization closely resembles the babbling that human infants produce in the months before they begin producing recognizable words. In humans, babbling is understood to serve important developmental functions. It allows the infant to explore the range of sounds their vocal apparatus can produce and begin to map the acoustic landscape of their native coop. Language. Researchers believe crow vocal play may serve similar functions. Allopreening, the mutual grooming of another individual's feathers, is a behavior that occurs not just between crow mates, but between other members of the same family group as well. A crow cannot easily reach the feathers on the back of its own head, the nape of its neck, or various other areas that benefit from regular grooming. Having a trusted companion preen these areas keeps the feathers in better condition, but also carries a clear social message. Allopreening requires physical proximity, tolerance of another bird within beak range, and a mutual willingness to be vulnerable. In crow family groups, the distribution of allopreening among members reflects the social structure of the group, with more allopreening occurring between closely bonded individuals than between more distant key. Associates. The phenomenon of crows leaving objects at locations associated with human feeding, the behavior popularly called gift-giving, is real. Documented by enough independent observers in enough different locations that researchers accept it as a genuine behavioral pattern, even while remaining cautious about its interpretation. The objects left range from natural items like acorns, pebbles, shells, and feathers, to human-made objects like buttons, screws, coins, pieces of foil, and broken jewelry. They are typically left at or very near the location where the human regularly provides food on a fence post, a railing, the edge of a bird bath as though deliberately placed for the human to find. Though whether deliberate placement is actually what's happening is a question that remains genuinely open. The scientific debate about crow gift-giving centers not on whether it happens, but on what cognitive processes drive it. Researchers like John Marsloff at the University of Washington, who has collected extensive accounts of the behavior, treat it as a genuine social phenomenon worth taking seriously, an expression of the crow's sophisticated social cognition operating in the context of a relationship with a specific human. Other behaviorists urge caution, noting that crows frequently carry and drop objects as a result of curiosity, food testing, and general object manipulation, and that a dropped object near a food site might be interpreted by an excited human as a gift when it was actually just an accidentally placed item. John Marsloff's own experience with crow gift-giving is telling. Despite spending decades studying crows and feeding many individuals during his research, he himself has never personally received an object from a crow. Yet his accounts from members of the public have convinced him that the phenomenon is real, a conclusion he reaches because the patterns reported are too consistent and too specific to be easily explained as coincidence. The same birds at the same location with the same specific person. Leaving objects regularly over extended periods of time, this pattern of behavior, even if its internal motivation remains opaque, represents something more than random dropping of objects. The specific objects that crows leave at feeding sites are themselves revealing, in the sense that they cluster in certain categories. Shiny or visually distinctive objects appear with particular frequency. Pieces of foil, coins, pieces of glass, bits of jewelry. Natural objects of interesting texture or shape also appear regularly. What is conspicuously absent from most accounts is food crows rarely leave food items for humans, even though food is obviously something they value highly. This suggests that whatever motivates the behavior, it is not a simple tit-for-tat exchange in which the crow leaves something edible in return for something edible received. The exchange, if it is an exchange at all, operates in a different currency. The case of Gabby Mann, a Seattle girl who began feeding crows near her home when she was 4 years old and maintained that feeding relationship for years, is one of the most extensively documented accounts of crow prey, gift-giving, ever recorded. The crows that Gabby fed regularly began leaving objects at her feeding station: colored pieces of glass, a miniature silver ball, a black button, a corroded bolt, a white oval piece, and eventually one half of a heart, shaped best friends, locket. Gabby carefully catalogued each object by date, preserving them in a plastic container organized like a small museum. The locket half became one of the most discussed items, a fragment of a piece of human jewelry left by a bird that had apparently found it somewhere and carried it to the feeding station. Crows are described by ecologists as synanthropic, a technical term meaning they naturally tend to live close to humans and integrate human-created environments into their normal behavioral repertoire. This is not a recent development forced on crows by habitat loss. The crow-human relationship appears to be genuinely ancient, predating modern cities, agriculture, and even most of what we think of as human civilization. Wherever humans settled, cleared land, accumulated food, and produced waste, crows followed. The two species have been cohabitating and mutually adapting to each other's presence for so long that some researchers describe their relationship as a form of ecological partnership, imperfect, sometimes contentious, but persistent across thousands of years and dozens of cultures. At least 30 of the world's approximately 130 Corvid species have successfully adapted to urbanized environments, according to a systematic global review of the research literature. The review found that the vast majority of studies, about 72%, reported net positive effects of urbanization on corvid populations, reflecting the fact that cities generally offer corvids more food, more artificial nesting sites, and substantially lower predation pressure than the rural and wild environments where their ancestors evolved. The ability to exploit urban environments effectively has made corvids as a group among the most successful wild birds in the human-dominated world of the 21st century. Urban crow populations differ from rural crow populations in several consistent ways that reflect adaptation to city living. Urban crows nest earlier in the spring, probably because urban environments are warmer and food availability is more predictable, allowing breeding to begin before wild food sources have fully emerged. They maintain smaller home ranges, because food is abundant enough within a small area that there's no need to patrol large territories. They tolerate human proximity more readily. An urban crow may allow a person to approach much more closely before taking flight than a rural crow would, and they show reduced territorial aggression toward prey. Neighboring crows, perhaps because the reliable food supply makes territorial defense less critical to survival. The Tel Aviv University research that tracked crow behavior during an unprecedented natural experiment, the sudden emptying of a dense urban environment of code. Human activity during a period of unusual public health restrictions found that crows responded differently from other bird species to the absence of humans. While some urban bird species increased their activity and range when humans were absent, crows actually reduced their activity, as though the removal of human activity had taken away something they depended on. This finding was interpreted as evidence that some urban crow populations have become genuinely integrated into human activity rhythms, not just tolerating humans, but actually depending on the patterns of human behavior as cues that guide their own foraging and movement. Wildlife ecologists classify urban species along a spectrum ranging from human avoiders, species that flee from human activity and avoid human-dominated areas, to human obligates, species that depend so heavily on human-created resources that they cannot thrive in their absence. Crows fall into the category called human exploiters, species that receive a direct, measurable benefit from living alongside humans while still being capable of surviving independently if necessary. This middle ground position is in many ways the optimal relationship with humanity for a wild animal, close enough to take advantage of the enormous resources that human settlements produce, while retaining enough independence to persist even if those resources become unavailable. In Norse mythology, the relationship between the god Odin and his two Corvid companions represents one of the oldest and most elaborated human attempts to give narrative form to the observed intelligence, wide-ranging behavior of crows and ravens. Hugin, whose name means thought, and Munin, whose name means memory, flew across the entire world each day and returned to Odin's shoulders each evening to whisper in his ears everything they had seen and heard. The choice of ravens or crows as the embodiment of thought and memory is not coincidental. For people who observed these birds closely over lifetimes, the crow's apparent attentiveness, its clear recognition of individuals, and its obvious processing of information must have seemed like evidence of a mind at Krek, genuinely engaged with the world. The ancient Greek association of crows with Apollo, the god of prophecy, light, and rational knowledge, reflects a different cultural angle on the same observed reality. Crows were seen as birds that knew things. They appeared before events, They gathered where death had occurred. They seemed to respond to human behavior in ways that suggested awareness and understanding. The Greek word for crow, koroni, became embedded in language and myth. The name of Apollo's mortal lover Coronis shares its root, and the bird's supposed ability to foretell the future made it a natural symbol for a god associated with prophecy. Foresight. Apollo's crow was his messenger, scout, and spy, a role that maps surprisingly well onto the actual behavioral ecology of wild crows. In Celtic traditions, particularly in Ireland and the broader Gaelic world, the crow's association with the goddess Morrigan gave it a significance that was simultaneously terrifying and sacred. The Morrigan was a complex figure associated with fate, sovereignty, battle, and transformation, and her appearance in crow form on the battlefield was understood not as random, but as purposeful. The goddess was present, observing, choosing, intervening. The crow's habit of appearing wherever carrion was available, including battlefields, and its obvious intelligence and attention to human prowl activity made it a natural vehicle for the projection of divine presence and supernatural awareness in cultures that read meaning into animal behavior. Hindu tradition assigns crows a role in ancestral veneration that reflects a deep cultural recognition of the crow's liminal status, its comfort at the boundary between the living world and the world of the dead. During the Shraddha ritual, performed to honor and nourish the spirits of deceased ancestors, food offerings called pinda are presented specifically to crows in the belief that the birds can carry these offerings to the spirits of the departed. The deity Shani, associated with the planet Saturn and with themes of karma, justice, and time, is traditionally depicted riding a large crow or raven. In this tradition, the crow is not merely a scavenger or pest, but a sacred intermediary with access to realms beyond ordinary human reach. The three-legged crow of East Asian mythology, called Yatagarasu in Japan, and known by related names in Chinese and Korean traditions, is associated specifically with the sun and with divine guidance. In Japanese mythology, the Yatagarasu is a solar bird that guided the legendary Emperor Jimmu on his journey to establish his kingdom, serving as a messenger from the sun goddess Amaterasu. The three-legged design sets this mythic crow apart from ordinary birds, marking it as supernatural and divine. The association of crows with the sun in these traditions contrasts sharply with their association with darkness and death in European far. Contexts, a reminder of how differently the same animal can be interpreted by different cultures, observing it from different vantage points. The Haida people of the Pacific Northwest coast of North America, whose culture was one of the most artistically and intellectually sophisticated of any indigenous civilization in the Americas, placed Raven at the very center of their creation mythology. Raven is simultaneously the creator of the world and its greatest trickster, responsible for stealing the sun from a box where it was being hoarded and releasing it into the sky so that the world could have light. This narrative, the crow or raven as the being who brings light to a dark world through cleverness and audacity, appears in various forms across many Pacific Northwest coast cultures, suggesting an ancient and widely shared recognition of the Corvid's special relationship with human life. The practice of augury in ancient Rome, reading the will of the gods through the behavior of birds, was a formal religious and political institution with its own specialized priests called augurs, its own technical vocabulary, its own ritual procedures, and its own lasting influence on Western political language. The word auspicious derives from the Latin auspicium, meaning the reading of bird signs. Crows and ravens featured prominently in augural practice because their behavior, their direction of flight, the pattern of their calls, their visible responses to events in the environment was believed to encode divine communication accessible to properly trained observers. The political and military decisions of Rome were regularly influenced by augural readings of bird behavior. The collective noun a murder of crows has captured the popular imagination so thoroughly that it now appears on everything from coffee mugs to horror movie posters. Yet its origins are more literary than scientific. The term appears in medieval English texts as part of a tradition of assigning fanciful, evocative collective nouns to groups of animals, nouns that were often more poetic than practically useful. The dark association of crows with death and ill fortune in medieval European culture, shaped partly by the Christian pea. Tradition's suspicion of carrion eaters, and partly by simple observation of crows appearing wherever death had recently occurred, made murder a natural, if dramatic, choice. Scientists use the neutral term flock. The Corvidae family encompasses a genuinely impressive range of birds that are related to crows without being crows in the strict sense. Rooks, jackdaws, jays, magpies, treepees, chows, and nutcrackers are all corvids members of the same family, and they share with crows the fundamental traits that define the group: large brains relative to body size, complex social lives, flexible and opportunistic behavior, and the capacity for sophisticated learning. The family as a whole contains approximately 135 species spread across every continent except Antarctica, representing one of the most evolutionarily successful bird families in the ET world. The smallest member of the corvid family is the dwarf jay of Mexico, a bird so compact and lightweight that it weighs only about 41 grams, roughly the same as a standard letter, and measures just 5 centimeters from bill to tail. At the other end of the size spectrum sit the common raven and the thick-billed raven, both of which can exceed 400 grams in body weight and stretch past 65 centimeters in length. This extraordinary range from a bird smaller than a sparrow to one larger than a red-tailed hawk exists within a single family, and it reflects the remarkable ecological diversity that corvids have achieved across millions of years of evolution on nearly every continent on Earth. Most corvid species, including most crows, are what biologists call sedentary birds. They don't migrate in the way that warblers, shorebirds, or waterfowl do, making long seasonal journeys between cref, breeding and wintering grounds. Instead, they remain in or near their established territories throughout the year, moving only short distances in response to local food availability or severe weather, when food shortages do force corvids to move. The resulting eruptive migrations can be dramatic, large numbers of birds shifting suddenly from depleted areas to more productive ones. But these movements lack the predictable seasonal regularity of true migration. For most crows in most years, the world within a few dozen miles of where they hatched is the world they inhabit for their entire lives. The breeding territory overlap between crows and ravens reveals something interesting about their different social strategies. Research on corvid territorial behavior has found that crows overlap their breeding territories with neighboring crow pairs, roughly 6 times more than ravens overlap with neighboring raven pairs. This greater territorial tolerance in crows, their willingness to accept other breeding pairs in close proximity, is thought to be one reason crows thrive in denser, more complex landscapes like agricultural areas, suburbs, and urban edges, where the landscape is divided into many small patches of suitable habitat. Ravens, with their larger territories and lower tolerance for neighbors, are better suited to the wide open spaces of wilderness, where competition for resources is lower and distances between breeding pairs naturally be large. The rook is one of the most socially distinctive members of the corvid family, setting itself apart from most crows through its strongly colonial nesting habits. While most crow species nest in dispersed pairs or small family groups with each nest well separated from the next, rooks gather in large, conspicuous nesting colonies called rookeries, assemblies of dozens to hundreds of nests packed into the same grove of trees. These rookeries are noisy, busy, and visible from long distances, representing a fundamentally different social strategy than the dispersed nesting typical of other corvids. The bare grey facial skin at the base of the rook's bill, which gives it a distinctive pale-faced appearance unlike any other European corvid, develops as the bird matures, gradually replacing the feathered face of juveniles. The jackdaw, the smallest member of the Corvus genus in Europe, has carved out an ecological niche that sets it apart from its larger corvid relatives. Where crows and rooks tend to nest in tree canopies, jackdaws are cavity nesters. They seek out holes in trees, crevices in rock faces, gaps in old stone buildings, and the interiors of chimneys as nesting sites. This preference for enclosed cavities protects jackdaw nests from many of the aerial predators that threaten open-cup nesters, and it allows jackdaws to nest in urban and suburban environments where suitable trees may be scarce, but old buildings with gaps and crevices are plentiful. Jackdaws are also notably social, forming large flocks and maintaining long-term pair bonds with a degree of apparent mutual affection that has attracted the attention of researchers studying avian social cognition. The Eurasian magpie, while not technically a crow, is a corvid that has contributed one of the most celebrated single findings in animal cognition research. In 2008, researchers at the University of Bochum in Germany demonstrated that Eurasian magpies could recognize their own reflections in teen. A mirror passing the so-called mirror self-recognition test that had previously been considered a capacity limited to humans. Great apes, dolphins, and elephants. When a colored mark was placed on the magpie's throat in a location visible only in a mirror, the bird used the mirror to investigate the mark on its own body behavior, interpreted as evidence that the bird understood the reflection as an image of itself, rather than another individual. It was the first demonstration of mirror self-recognition in any non-mammalian species. Clark's nutcracker, a corvid of the high mountain forests of western North America, has evolved a memory system so specialized and so precise that it has become a landmark case study in the neuroscience of spatial ball. Memory. Each autumn, a single Clark's nutcracker caches more than 30,000 individual pinyon pine seeds across thousands of separate hiding sites, scattered across a large geographic area. 9 months later, buried under snow and with the landscape substantially altered by winter weather, the nutcracker can locate and retrieve these caches with remarkable accuracy. The precision of this feat requires a spatial memory system capable of storing and retrieving thousands of individual location-specific memories over a period of months, a capacity that has informed research on the neural basis of spatial cognition in all vertebrates. The navigation strategy that Clark's nutcrackers use to find their cached seeds has been carefully studied and reveals a preference for stable, vertically prominent landmarks, features like specific rock outcrops, distinctive trees or cliff faces over surface-level features that may be obscured by snow. By anchoring cache locations to landmarks that remain visible regardless of seasonal change, the nutcracker maintains reliable reference points for retrieval, even in the dramatically altered winter landscape. This insight that spatial memory in animals is organized around stable environmental features rather than absolute positions has had broad implications for cognitive neuroscience research well beyond the sire. Study of corvids. Scrub jays, members of a corvid genus closely related to crows, have been among the most intensively studied birds in cognitive science, partly because of their spectacular episodic-like memory and their apparent capacity for something resembling theory of mind. In experiments designed to test whether scrub jays understand that other individuals have knowledge states different from their own, birds that had previously stolen food from others' caches showed strategic RE caching behavior when observed moving their own caches to new locations, specifically when they knew another bird had watched them cache. Birds without prior theft experience did not show this behavior. suggesting the response was learned from personal experience, with the risk of having one's own food stolen by a knowledgeable observer. The brain-to-body mass ratio of corvids as a group sits at a level comparable to that of non-human great apes and dolphins, two groups of T. Animals that are widely recognized as among the most intelligent non-human animals on Earth, and only slightly below the ratio found in humans. This figure, while not the only or even the best measure of cognitive capacity, provides a rough indication of the computational resources available to a corvid brain relative to the demands of managing the bird's body. The fact that corvids fall into the same range as great apes and cetaceans on this measure was surprising when it was first calculated, and it contributed substantially to the shift in scientific attitudes toward avian intelligence that has characterized the past 3 decades of research. The discovery that New Caledonian crows can construct compound tools from multiple separate components puts them in a category of technological achievement that, until recently, was considered the exclusive domain of humans and great apes. Archaeologists studying human prehistory note that compound tool manufacture assembling multiple components into a single functional instrument appears in the human fossil record only around Pratt. 300,000 years ago, during the Middle Paleolithic, and is associated with a significant expansion in the complexity of human cognitive and cultural life. The fact that a bird, working alone, without training, and encountering the problem for the first time, can spontaneously achieve this same feat invites a profound reconsideration of what compound tool use actually requires in terms of underlying cognition. The debate about whether crow intelligence represents convergent evolution, independent development of similar cognitive abilities in 2 separate lineages, birds and mammals, or some form of shared ancestral capacity, is one of the most actively discussed questions in evolutionary biology and cognitive science. The 2 possibilities have different implications. If crow and primate intelligence evolved independently, it suggests that the same cognitive solutions tend to re-emerge whenever natural selection consistently favors complex social behavior and flexible problem-solving, that intelligence is, in some sense, an attractor state that evolution finds repeatedly. If there is some shared ancestral basis, it suggests that the cognitive foundations of complex thought are far older than we imagined, predating the split between birds and mammals more than 300 million years ago. The revelation that a cerebral cortex is not necessary for complex cognition has been one of the most consequential findings to emerge from decades of corvid research. The neocortex, the deeply folded outer layer of the mammalian brain, was long assumed to be the anatomical structure responsible for the highest levels of cognitive processing in animals. Crows, which lack a neocortex entirely, were therefore assumed to be incapable of the cognitive feats associated with neocortical function. The discovery that the crow's pallium, a structurally quite different brain region, can support reasoning, planning, self-awareness, and even consciousness has required a fundamental revision of neuroscientific theories about the relationship between brain structure and cognitive capacity. The pigeon served as the default model organism for avian cognition research for much of the 20th century, in large part because pigeons are inexpensive, easy to maintain in laboratory conditions, and tolerant of the handling and confinement that experimental research requires. Decades of pigeon research contributed genuinely valuable knowledge about associative learning, reinforcement schedules, and basic sensory processing in birds. But because pigeons are not particularly cognitively sophisticated animals, they learn by association but show little evidence of causal reasoning. Planning, or flexible problem-solving, the pigeon-based literature created a systematically underestimated picture of what bird brains can do. When crow researchers began publishing their findings, the contrast was striking enough to force a wholesale reconsideration of avian cognitive capacity. The influence of Corvid research on artificial intelligence development is an interesting and somewhat unexpected spillover from what began as pure behavioral ecology. The crow's ability to produce contextually appropriate vocalizations, varying the form and content of its calls based on the situation. The audience and the history of previous interactions presents a model of adaptive, context-sensitive communication that researchers working on natural language processing have found instructive. Machine learning systems that need to generate appropriate language responses in varying contexts face similar challenges to those that a crow faces when deciding how to call in different social situations. And studying how crows solve the problem biologically has informed some approaches to building systems that solve it computationally. The carrion crow and hooded crow represent one of nature's clearest examples of two closely related forms in the process of potentially becoming or potentially remaining distinct species. Where their ranges meet across a narrow transition zone running through parts of Europe, the two forms interbreed and produce viable hybrid offspring, which would normally be a strong argument for treating them as a Christian. Single species. Yet the transition zone remains remarkably narrow, only a few kilometers wide in some locations, despite the two forms having ample opportunity to merge over thousands of years. Something appears to be maintaining their distinctiveness, even in the face of ongoing hybridization. And understanding what that something is has made the carrion-hooded crow contact zone a productive natural laboratory for studying the early stages of speciation. The Taresian crow of Australia and New Guinea has become an important study species for understanding how corvid behavior and brain function change in response to urbanization. Research conducted over decades in Brisbane, Australia, has found that urban Taresian crows differ measurably from their rural counterparts in several behavioral dimensions. They are bolder, more exploratory, more tolerant of human proximity, and more likely to engage in novel food-finding strategies. These differences are consistent enough within urban populations to raise the question of whether they reflect genetic adaptation, actual evolutionary change driven by the pair. Different selection pressures of city life or behavioral plasticity flexible responses to a changed environment that any individual crow could make regardless of its genetic background. The brown-headed crow of New Guinea represents the kind of species that reminds researchers how much of the corvid world remains essentially unknown. Its distinctively brownish-black head sets it apart visually from most members of the genus. But beyond this physical description and some basic notes on its habitat preferences and range, almost nothing has been published about its behavior, social structure, diet, or cognitive abilities. It is likely intelligent and socially complex, as all corvids appear to be, but whether it uses tools, how it communicates, what its family structure looks like, and how it compares cognitively to better-studied relatives are questions that simply haven't been asked yet, for lack of researchers willing and able to work in its remote forest habitat. The white-billed crow of the southern Solomon Islands is a bird that inhabits one of the most ecologically rich and most politically complex regions in the world. On islands where forest loss is accelerating and where the resources and institutional capacity for wildlife research are limited. Like many island corvids, it faces the particular vulnerability of having a small, geographically restricted population with nowhere to retreat if its habitat is degraded or destroyed. Island species cannot simply expand their range in response to local problems. The way continental species can, they are bounded by water. This geographic constraint makes island corvids disproportionately vulnerable to extinction relative to their mainland relatives, and it means that losing one island species means losing it forever. The grey crow of New Guinea, also called the bare-faced crow, because of the patch of unfeathered skin around its eyes, and on its cheeks represents an unusual physical departure from the typical corvid appearance. Most corvids are fully feathered on the face, The bare facial skin of the grey crow is a distinctive and somewhat startling feature that gives the bird an almost lizard-like quality at close range. This kind of bare facial skin is more commonly associated with vultures and other carrion-eating birds, where it may reduce the accumulation of blood and tissue during feeding. Whether the bare-faced crow's unfeathered face serves a similar function or evolved for entirely different reasons is one of the many unanswered questions about this poorly known species. The violet crow of Seram Island in Indonesia spent most of the 20th century as little more than a name attached to a handful of museum specimens collected by 19th century naturalists. For decades, it was essentially unknown in life. Its calls, unrecorded, its behavior undescribed, its population size unassessed. Recent field surveys have finally documented living individuals in the primary forests of Seram, confirming the species' continued existence and beginning the process of building a basic biological profile. The violet crow's situation illustrates how many gaps remain in our knowledge of the world's crow diversity and how much of what we think we know about crows is actually based on a handful of well-studied species, while dozens of others remain nearly as mysterious as they were a century ago. The Flores crow of Indonesia is listed as vulnerable to extinction, a status reflecting the ongoing loss of lowland forest on Flores Island to agricultural expansion. Like many endemic island species, the Flores crow exists nowhere else on Earth. If the forests of Flores are degraded beyond the point where the crow can maintain a viable population, the species disappears permanently from the world. The pace of forest loss on small Indonesian islands has been rapid, driven by a combination of population growth, agricultural demand, and limited regulatory capacity. Conservation assessments of the Flores crow and of many similar island endemics note the urgent need for habitat protection before populations decline past the threshold of recovery. The devastating impact of the brown tree snake on Guam's native bird fauna, including the Mariana crow, is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of invasive species-driven extinction in the world. The snake, accidentally introduced to Guam in the late 1940s, likely as a stowaway on military cargo aircraft or ships, found an island whose birds had evolved with no snake predators, were entirely unprepared for this new threat. Within decades, it had driven most of Guam's native forest birds to extinction or near extinction. The Mariana crow survived on Guam only because adults are large enough to potentially escape snake predation. But their nests and nestlings remain vulnerable, making successful breeding extremely difficult in the Kra, snake-infested lowland forests. The story of the Hawaiian crow's extinction and attempted recovery is one of the most emotionally resonant in contemporary conservation biology. When the last wild alala disappeared from the forests of the Big Island of Hawaii in 2002, it marked the end of thousands of years of crow presence in the Hawaiian Islands, an end caused by a combination of introduced predators, avian diseases, and habitat loss. The birds that remained existed only in captivity. Years of careful breeding work gradually increased the captive population to the point where reintroduction became conceivable. And releases onto the Big Island and later Maui began with cautious optimism. The early results were mixed. Some released birds died, others disappeared, but the effort continues. Driven by the conviction that a world without the alala would be a diminished one. The discovery that the alala is a tool user, observed spontaneously using sticks to probe for food in captivity, without any training or exposure to tool-using models, was a remarkable finding that added new significance to its conservation story. Before this discovery, the New Caledonian crow was essentially alone among corvids in being documented as a habitual tool user. The alala's tool use suggests that this cognitive capacity may be more widespread in the corvid car family than previously recognized. and raises the question of whether alala populations in the wild, had they survived intact, might have developed two-using traditions similar to those of New Caledonian crows. The answer will never be known for the extinct wild population, but it adds urgency to efforts to restore the species to a functioning wild state. The Caribbean crow species, the Jamaican crow, the Cuban crow, the palm crow of Cuba and Hispaniola, and the white-necked crow of Hispaniola and Puerto Rico represent a distinct regional radiation of corvids in the island Caribbean, each species having evolved in isolation on its particular island or island group. These Caribbean crows are among the least studied of all the world's corvid species, known primarily from natural history collections and brief field observations rather than systematic behavioral or ecological research. The white-necked crow, classified as vulnerable to extinction, faces ongoing pressure from hunting and forest loss, while the others persist in various states of abundance that are not well quantified. The introduction of rooks to New Zealand in the 1860 was part of a broader effort by European colonists to recreate the familiar fauna of their homeland in the Southern Hemisphere, an effort team. That included the introduction of dozens of bird, mammal, and insect species with consequences that ranged from ecologically negligible to catastrophic. Rooks were brought in specifically to control agricultural insect pests, a role they had played in Europe for centuries. In the New Zealand context, however, rooks quickly became pests themselves, causing damage to crops and competing with native birds. Today, they are managed as an invasive species, subject to culling programs, a complete reversal of their original intended role that illustrates the unpredictability of ecological introductions. House crows have spread from their native South Asian range to coastal cities across East Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and beyond by exploiting one of the defining features of the modern globalized world: the constant movement of ships between ports. House crows are opportunistic enough to board vessels docked in port, find shelter and food in the ship's cargo or structure, and survive the journey to a new port city where they disembark and, if conditions are favorable, establish a new population. This ship-assisted dispersal has made the house crow one of the most widely distributed introduced birds in the world, a remarkable feat for a species that doesn't fly over open ocean. House crow populations in their introduced range have caused real ecological and public health concerns, and eradication efforts have been undertaken in several countries and island territories. In places like the Maldives, Oman, and parts of East Africa, house crows have established large, aggressive populations that compete with native birds for food and nesting sites, predate the eggs and chicks of other species, and because they forage extensively in urban waste, act as potential vectors for the transmission of pathogens, including salmonella and avian tuberculosis. Managing invasive house crow populations has proven challenging precisely because of the same intelligence and adaptability that makes all corvids so ecologically successful. They learn quickly to avoid traps and baiting programs. The genetic diversity found within house crow populations across their vast introduced range is itself a topic of active research. A study of house crow populations in Pakistan using DNA barcoding techniques found 9 distinct genetic variants within a relatively small geographic sample, indicating that even populations separated by modest distances can diverge measurably at the molecular level. This within-species diversity has practical implications for understanding the history of crow invasions, which source populations contributed to which introduced populations, whether multiple introduction events occurred independently in different locations, and whether genetic factors contribute to the variation in invasiveness observed between different house crow populations around the world. Crows and their corvid relatives occupy an unusual position in the world of ornithology, as among the very few wild animals that have been documented engaging in something resembling reciprocal exchange with individual humans. While many animals accept food from humans and some become accustomed to human presence, the specific pattern of crows apparently leaving objects at the same locations where individual humans regularly come to provide food, and doing so with specific, consistent individuals rather than at any location where food is available suggests a social sophistication in managing interspecies relationships that few other wild animals approach. The scientific name Corvus brachyrhynchos contains a small etymological irony that ornithologists find mildly amusing. Brachyrhynchos comes from Greek roots meaning short beak, brachys meaning short, and rhynchos meaning beak or bill. Applied to a crow, this name is a bit odd, since the American crow doesn't have a notably short bill by any reasonable comparison. The name was assigned by the German ornithologist Christian Ludwig Breim in 1822, and while nomenclatural rules prevent it from being changed to something more descriptively accurate, it serves as a reminder that early taxonomists were working with limited material and limited comparative context, and that the names they assigned sometimes reflect the particular specimens they happened to examine rather than the species as a whole. The consolidation of the American crow, the western crow, and the northwestern crow under a single species name reflect a broader trend in modern ornithology toward using genetic data to inform taxonomic decisions. For most of the 20th century, taxonomists relied primarily on physical appearance and geographic distribution to define species boundaries, which led to the recognition of several crow species that genetic analysis later revealed were actually populations of the same species in the process of gradual divergence. The fact that what was once the northwestern crow is now simply the northwestern subspecies of the American crow doesn't make the bird less interesting. It simply places its distinctiveness within a more accurate evolutionary context. The formal scientific description of the American crow was published by Breim in 1822, making it one of the earlier North American bird species to receive formal scientific scow recognition under the Linnaean binomial system. The type specimen, the physical bird used as the reference standard for the species description, was later designated as having come from the vicinity of Boston, Massachusetts, anchoring the species' scientific identity to a specific geographic location in the northeastern United States. Today, the American crow's scientific name, physical description, and taxonomic placement are maintained by the International Ornithologists' Union, which periodically reviews and updates the official list of the world's bird species as new research accumulates. The possibility that studying Corvid communication could illuminate the evolutionary origins of human language is one of the more speculative but genuinely interesting threads in contemporary cognitive science. Human language is often described as uniquely complex, combining arbitrary symbols, hierarchical grammatical structure, reference to absent objects and past events, and the ability to generate an infinite number of novel sentences from a finite set of elements. Some of these features, in less elaborate forms, appear to be present in crow communication. Individual recognition through vocalization, contextually specific calls that reference specific objects or events. And as the 2025 Menzerath's law finding suggests, structural regularities in call sequences that parallel aspects of linguistic organization. Crow social networks, the maps of who interacts with whom, how frequently, and in what contexts have been analyzed mathematically using tools borrowed from the study of human social networks and the internet. These analyses reveal that crow social networks are not random. They have specific structural properties, including the presence of highly connected AZS, individuals who interact with many others, and more peripheral individuals who interact primarily with a small number of close associates. Information and behaviors tend to spread through social networks along pathways determined by these structural properties, meaning that highly connected individuals play a disproportionate role in cultural transmission within crow populations. The decades-long crow studies conducted by researchers like Kevin McGowan in Ithaca, New York and Carolee Caffrey in California and Oklahoma represent a kind of scientific commitment that is increasingly rare. The willingness to return to the same population of individually marked animals, year after year for decades, building a dataset of sufficient depth to reveal patterns that shorter studies cannot detect. These long-term studies have revealed multi-generational family histories, tracked the fates of hundreds of individual birds over their entire lifetimes, and documented the social consequences of disease outbreaks, territorial conflicts, and the deaths of key individuals. The knowledge they have generated could not have been obtained any other way. Crow research has become genuinely citizen science friendly in ways that have meaningfully expanded the scientific knowledge base. The North American Breeding Bird Survey, which enlists trained volunteer birders to conduct standardized point counts along fixed routes each breeding season, relies on crow sightings to track population trends across the continent. Reporting programs for dead birds during West Nile virus outbreaks collected data from millions of public observers that no professional research team could have gathered independently. And accounts of crow behavior, gift-giving, tool use, unusual interactions with other species submitted by observant members of the public have contributed to the scientific literature on Corvid cognition in ways that blur the traditional boundary between professional and amateur natural history. The relationship between crows and humans has been shaped and reshaped by the same forces that have shaped all of human history. The clearing of forests, the expansion of agriculture, the growth of cities, the spread of disease, the development of firearms, and the emergence of conservation ethics. Crows have navigated all of these changes with remarkable success, adjusting their behavior, their distribution, and their relationship with our species at each turn. What has remained constant throughout is the essential nature of the bird: curious, intelligent, socially complex, and deeply attentive to the world around it. In that attentiveness, that quality of observation and apparent understanding, crows have reflected something back at us that has always unsettled and fascinated in equal measure. The anting behavior of crows, in which a bird lies down in or near an active ant colony and allows the ants to move through its feathers, or actively rubs ants against its plumage, is one of those behaviors that resists simple explanation despite having been documented in dozens of bird species. The leading hypothesis is that the formic acid released by the ants acts as a natural pesticide, killing or repelling the feather mites, lice, and other ectoparasites that live in bird plumage. If this is correct, it represents a crow using another organism as a chemical tool, applying a substance produced by ants for the purpose of maintaining its own feather condition. Whether crows understand the causal relationship involved or simply engage in the behavior because it feels good is a question that remains genuinely unresolved. Bathing behavior in crows is more varied and apparently more personally motivated than the functional necessity of feather maintenance alone might require. Crows bathe in puddles, bird baths, shallow streams, and open water with what observers consistently describe as evident enthusiasm, splashing vigorously, dunking their heads, fluffing and shaking their wings repeatedly. Documented instances of crows bathing in carbonated water add an element of apparent selectivity and novelty-seeking to the picture. After bathing, crows engage in extended preening sessions that serve the genuine maintenance function of realigning the microscopic barbs of their feathers and distributing waterproofing oils from the preen gland. But the vigor and apparent pleasure of the bathing itself suggests it may be more than mere grooming. perhaps another form of sensory play. Snow bathing, in which crows roll in fresh snow, press their bodies into it, and fluff their feathers into the powder, appears to be functionally analogous to dust bathing in other bird species, using a particular medium to clean and condition feathers. But the behavior has a quality that observers find endearing. Birds that snowbathe seem to do so with a deliberateness and physical engagement that goes beyond mechanical hygiene. A crow pressing its chest into fresh snow and spreading its wings while its feathers fill with powder looks, to human eyes, like an animal enjoying a physical sensation. And while we must be cautious about projecting our own experiences onto other species, the behavior is consistent with what we would expect from an animal that we know engages in other forms of apparent play and sensory exploration. Crow migrations, where they occur, are gentle affairs by bird migration standards. Rather than the multi-thousand-mile journeys of Arctic terns or bar-tailed godwits, crow migrations involve relatively short southward movements in northern populations, shifts of perhaps a few hundred kilometers that take individual birds from areas where winter conditions are genuinely harsh to areas where they are merely uncomfortable. Many crow populations don't migrate at all, remaining on or near their breeding territories throughout the year. The partial nature of crow migration, in which some individuals in a population migrate while others remain, suggests that the decision to migrate may be flexible, influenced by individual condition, local food availability, and the severity of local winter weather. Within crow populations that show partial migration, younger birds tend to move more than established adults, and females may move more than males in some populations. This pattern, young and female birds bearing more of the migratory burden while experienced established males hold their territories through winter, reflects the competitive dynamics of crow social life. An established breeding male who has spent years building a territory and a social network has much to lose by abandoning it for the winter and much to gain by defending it year-round. A young bird or a female without an established breeding position has less to protect and potentially more to gain by moving to areas where food is more available. The sensory world of a crow extends beyond what human senses can access in ways that are genuinely difficult to fully appreciate. Crows can perceive ultraviolet light wavelengths shorter than visible light that are invisible to the human eye, because their eyes contain 4 types of color receptors compared to the 3 that humans have. This additional color channel allows crows to see the world in a form of color that has no human equivalent. Many natural objects that appear uniform in color to human eyes, certain berries, insects, feathers, and plant surfaces, reflect UV light differently from their backgrounds. And crows may be able to use this additional information channel to assess the ripeness of fruit, the health of prey, or the quality of potential mates. The lateral placement of a crow's eyes on either side of its head gives each eye a wide monocular visual field, allowing the bird to monitor a broad sweep of its surroundings for approaching threats without turning its head. The 2 visual fields overlap at the front of the head, creating a zone of binocular vision, where both eyes see the same object simultaneously that provides the depth perception needed for precision tasks like picking up small objects, manipulating tools, and judging distances accurately during landing. This combination of wide monocular surveillance and forward-focused binocular precision is well suited to the crow's lifestyle, as both a vigilant prey avoider and a dexterous object-manipulating geese. Forager. Researchers who have spent years conducting experiments with crows consistently note something that goes beyond the specific cognitive findings they publish in academic journals. The birds seem to be paying attention to the pauka experiment itself. Crows watch the researchers, track their movements, respond differently to familiar versus unfamiliar humans, and adjust their behavior based on what they appear to have learned about the specific people conducting the study. Some experimental protocols have had to be redesigned because the crows figured out aspects of the experimental setup that the researchers hadn't anticipated and began exploiting that understanding in ways that confounded the original measurements. Working with crows, researchers say, feels less like running an experiment on a passive subject and more like engaging in a mutual investigation with a curious and attentive mind. And so, we find ourselves, very gently, at the end of this long journey through the world of crows birds that have walked beside human civilization for longer than we have kept records of anything, that have appeared in our stories and our mythologies and our fears and our affections across every culture that has ever shared a landscape with them. They cache food in the cold ground and remember where they left it months later. They recognize individual faces and carry those memories for years. They play in the snow and leave pebbles at the doors of people who feed them. They think about problems before they solve them, and sometimes they solve problems that we didn't expect them to be able to solve at all. They are, in some sense, already here, already watching, already curious, already living their rich and complicated lives just at the edge of our awareness. And perhaps the most restful thought to carry into sleep is simply this: the crows are out there tonight, in their thousands and their millions, roosting in the dark trees, tapped close together against the cold, dreaming whatever it is that crows dream and the world is, in that quiet way, a little more interesting for it.